Come close now, children. Gather round this fire that crackles like it remembers the time of chains, too. Open them ears wide and your hearts even wider, 'cause the remembrance I'm fixing to tell ain't written in no white man's book. It lives in the blood of the earth, in the bones buried beneath them cotton fields, and in the last breath of folk who survived the whip, the coffin ships, and the sound of iron dragging across the cellar floor. Her name was Emily, but in them days of shadow and red-hot iron, everybody called her Emily of the Chains. Lord have mercy on us all. That name didn't come from nowhere. It came from pain, came from struggle, came from a promise made between blood and tears on a night when even the angels feared to come down from glory. Listen here, folk, and listen good. In them days of deep sorrow, when the auction block stood in every town square like a altar to human misery, there lived on a plantation in the low country of South Carolina a young woman who carried the memory of all them souls who perished in the Middle Passage. Emily was her given name, but the spirit that lived inside her chest belonged to warriors and conjure women, to griots who sang the old songs and root doctors who spoke with the dead. She was a woman of maybe 20-some years, lean as a cypress branch but strong-backed like her people always been. Her eyes, sweet Jesus, her eyes held the weight of every mother torn from her child, every father sold down river, every baby born into bondage. The old one said she had the sight that she could see spirits walking mongst the living, that she knew things before they happened. Her mama, before she was sold away to God knows where, whispered to little Emily one last time, "Child, you survive. You survive to tell what I never could." And Emily carried them words like a sacred charm, like a mojo bag pressed close to her heart. The plantation where she labored was grand and proud and cruel as winter wind. White-columned big house standing tall like it was something holy, but underneath all that prettiness ran rivers of blood and tears. The cotton fields stretched far as the eye could see, white bowls noddin' in the breeze like they was innocent of the sufferin' that grew 'em. But folk who worked them fields knew the truth. Every strand of cotton was watered with sweat and sanctified with sorrow. Down at the back of the plantation, hidden like a shameful secret, sat the punishment seller. Lord of glory, that place was hell on earth. Cold stone walls weepin' with dampness, dirt floor hard-packed with the blood of the beaten, and a ceiling so low a grown person couldn't stand upright. That cellar was where they sent the rebellious ones, the proud ones, the ones who wouldn't bow down low enough to suit the white folks. And it was there, in that pit of despair, that Emily's destiny would be forged in iron and sealed with water. The master of that plantation was a man whose heart had turned to stone, long before Emily ever drew breath. He was the kind of white man who saw black folk as chattels and nothing more, who believed his pale skin gave him dominion over souls that belonged to the Almighty alone. This master, this overseer of human misery, he took particular offense to Emily's spirit. Something about the way she held her head high, the way she looked him straight in the eye when he spoke to her, the way she never begged or groveled or acted like she was grateful for his cruelty. He wanted to break her, wanted to see her crawling on her belly like a snake, wanted to hear her beg forgiveness for the sin of being born black in a white man's world. But Emily, Lord have mercy, Emily wasn't the breaking kind. Now the master's son, young Massa with soft hands and a softer mind, he was near, 'bout grown, but still suckling at his daddy's hate like a baby at his mama's breast. This boy had been raised to believe that black folk wasn't quite human, that they was something in between animal and person, created by God to serve the white race till the end of time. The stage was set, children. The players was in place. And somewhere in the spirit world, the ancestors was stirring, knowing that a reckoning was comin' like thunder after lightning. Them plantation bells would ring at dawn, callin' the enslaved to another day of toilin' under the burnin' sun. But on the mornin' when Emily's fate would change forever, something heavy hung in the air. The old root doctor, bent and weathered like an ancient oak, looked up at the sky and shook his gray head. "Storm comin'," he whispered to anyone who'd listen. "Not the kind that brings rain, the kind that brings judgment." And in the quarters that night, when the whippoorwills sang their lonesome songs and the Spanish moss rustled like the voices of the dead, Emily sat by her small fire and felt the weight of destiny settling round her shoulders like a burial shroud. She didn't know it yet, But tomorrow would be the day she'd have to choose between her own safety and another sister's dignity. Tomorrow would be the day the master would demand something of her that would turn her stomach and stain her soul. And tomorrow would be the first day of 90 that would test every ounce of strength the ancestors had poured into her bones. The fire crackled low, and Emily stared into them flames like she was reading prophecy in the embers. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the quarters, a screech owl called 3 times, and every soul on that plantation knew that meant death was walking amongst the living. But whose death? That was still to be revealed. Now let me tell you about Emily before the iron claimed her. Before them, 90 days in darkness changed her from woman to legend. 'Cause to understand what she became, you got to know who she was when she still walked free beneath the same sun that warmed the master's face. Emily had come to that South Carolina plantation as a girl of maybe 14 winters, sold down from Virginia when her previous master met his maker at the bottom of a whiskey bottle. She'd been torn from her mama's arms like fruit ripped from the vine before it's ready. But even in them early days, folk could see she carried something special inside her chest. The old ones in the quarters took to her straight away. They saw how she moved like she was dancing to music only she could hear, how her hands seemed to know the old ways without nobody teaching her, how she could look at a sick person and know what roots would heal 'em. They whispered, amongst themselves, that she must have conjure blood in her veins, that maybe her grandmother had been one of them powerful women who could call down rain and speak with spirits. Aunt Sarah, the eldest woman in the quarters, had taken Emily under her wing like a hen protecting her chick. Sarah was old as dirt and twice as wise, a woman who remembered when her grandmother spoke nothing but the old tongue from across the water. She taught Emily the secret songs, the ones that sounded like field hollers to white ears, but was really prayers to the ancestors, calls for protection, promises to never forget where they came from. "Child," Sarah would whisper while they shucked corn by firelight, "you got the gift. I can see it shining round you like morning mist. But gifts like yours come with a price. The spirits don't give such power to folk who gonna waste it on small things. They savin' you for something big." Emily learned to make medicine from pokeweed and yellow root, to read signs in the flight of birds, to know when rain was coming by the way the crickets sang. She learned which trees held friendly spirits, and which ones harbored haints that would lead you astray. Most important of all, she learned to hide her light under a basket, to let the white folks think she was just another field hand with strong arms and a weak mind. But Lord have mercy, that girl's spirit burned bright as a lighthouse in a storm. When Sunday came and the overseer allowed them to hold their praise meetings, Emily's voice would rise above all the others. She'd sing the spirituals with such power that even the white folks up at the big house would stop what they was doing and listen. Her voice carried pain and hope all tangled together, sorrow and joy wrapped up like a baby in swaddling clothes. "Wade in the water, children," she'd sing, and every soul in that praise house knew she wasn't just talking about getting baptized. She was talking about the Underground Railroad, about freedom, about crossing over into the promised land where no master could follow. The men in the quarters respected her, not just 'cause she was comely to look at with her high cheekbones and eyes like polished coal, but 'cause she carried herself like a queen in exile. She never allowed no man to treat her rough, never let nobody think they could claim her body just 'cause her soul belonged to another. There was a young man named Moses who wanted to jump the broom with her, a strong buck with gentle hands and a mind sharp as a razor. But Emily always said she was waiting for a sign from the spirits, waiting to know if love was something she could afford in a world that stole everything precious. The women trusted her with their secrets, their herbs for preventing babies they couldn't bear to see born into bondage, their plans for running when the moon was dark, their fears about children sold away and husbands whipped near to death. Emily held all them secrets like water in cupped hands, never letting a drop spill where it might cause harm. She worked in the big house sometimes, serving at table when the master had important guests, dusting the fine furniture that was worth more than a dozen human lives. The mistress took a particular dislike to Emily, maybe because she could see that beneath the humble exterior lived a spirit that would never truly bow. The white woman would find fault with everything Emily did, would slap her for dropping a spoon or speaking too loud or not speaking at all. But Emily endured. She endured because she knew her mama's spirit was watching, because she knew the ancestors expected her to survive, 'cause deep in her bones she felt something important was coming, and she had to be ready for it. The master himself rarely paid her much mind in them early years. To him, she was just another piece of property, valuable for her youth and strength but not worthy of particular attention. He didn't see the way other enslaved folk looked to her for guidance when trouble came, didn't notice how she could calm a crying baby with just a touch of her hand, didn't realize that she was becoming the heart of the quarters, the one who held everybody together when the world seemed bent on tearing them apart. But as Emily grew from girl to woman, as her body filled out and her spirit grew stronger, the master began to take notice. He saw how she moved with dignity even when her dress was patched and her feet was bare. He saw how she looked him in the eye when he spoke, not defiant exactly, but not submissive neither. And something about that look began to eat at him like a worm in rotten fruit. He started finding excuses to call her to the big house more often, started watching her with eyes that made her skin crawl. The other women warned her to be careful, told her stories about masters who took what they wanted whether it was freely given or not. But Emily had something them other women didn't have. She had the protection of the spirits, and more than that, she had a will that couldn't be broken by any earthly power. The tension began to build like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The master's son, now grown into a cruel young man with his daddy's cold heart, started paying attention to Emily too. Father and son would whisper together, and them whispers carried poison like snake bites. Emily felt the change coming like an animal feels earthquake before the ground starts shaking. She began preparing herself, praying harder, asking the ancestors for strength and wisdom. She didn't know yet what form the test would take, but she knew it was coming sure as winter follows fall. In the quarters at night, when the fire burned low and shadows danced like spirits on the walls, Emily would sit with the oldest women and listen to their stories. They told her about Nat Turner, who had visions from God and led a rebellion that shook the South like an earthquake. They told her about Denmark Vesey, who planned the uprising in Charleston that would have freed every enslaved soul in South Carolina if somebody hadn't betrayed it. They told her about Harriet Tubman, called Moses, who walked through hell itself to lead her people to freedom. Sometimes, old Aunt Sarah would say, rocking back and forth like she was nursing all the pain in the world, the Lord calls on someone to be a witness. Sometimes he calls on someone to be a deliverer. And sometimes, child, he calls on someone to be a sacrifice. Emily didn't know it yet, but she was fixing to be all three. Sweet Jesus, let me paint you a picture of that plantation where Emily labored, that monument to human misery dressed up in white paint and pride. Picture it clear in your mind's eye, 'cause you got to understand the belly of the beast before you can know why it had to be cut open, and its poison spilled out on the ground. The plantation stretched from the river bottom to the pine woods, near about 3,000 acres of stolen land worked by stolen people. The big house sat on a little rise like a white sepulchre, all columns and porches and fancy windows that caught the morning light and threw it back like they was too good to hold on to common sunshine. Magnolia trees lined the drive, their white blooms smelling sweet as perfume but hiding the stench of human bondage that rose from them fields like mist off a swamp. Master John Whitmore was his name, though most folk just called him Massa or the Devil, depending on whether he was listening or not. He was a man in his middle years, thick round the belly from good living and cruel round the heart from bad choosing. His hands was soft as a baby's bottom, never having done a day's honest work in his life, but his eyes was hard as winter ground and twice as cold. He'd inherited that plantation from his daddy, who'd inherited it from his daddy before him, along with a legacy of treating black folk like they wasn't quite human. 3 generations of Whitmores had ruled over that piece of hell, each one passing down to the next the belief that white skin was a blessing from God, and dark skin was a curse to be exploited. The mistress, Miss Catherine Whitmore, was a pale, nervous woman who spent her days sipping tea and complaining about the heat, the servants, the difficulties of managing so many slaves. She had the kind of beauty that wilted in the sun, all porcelain skin and golden hair that she kept covered with bonnets and parasols, like she was afraid the world might stain her if she looked at it too direct. But it was young Master Robert, their only son, who carried the deepest poison in his veins. 22 years old and rotten to the core, he'd been raised to believe that black folk existed solely for his pleasure and convenience. He was handsome in the way poisonous things often are, with his daddy's blue eyes and his mama's golden hair, but something had gone wrong in the making of his soul. The overseer, a poor white man named Jake Morrison, did the family's dirty work with enthusiasm that would have shamed the devil himself. Morrison was the kind of white man who hated black folk not 'cause they'd ever done him harm, but 'cause he needed somebody to look down on to make himself feel bigger. He carried a whip, like other men carried walking sticks, and his hands was always stained with somebody else's blood. Now let me tell you about the quarters where Emily and her people lived, so you can understand the difference between the world of the oppressor and the world of the oppressed. Them slave cabins was built in 2 long rows, like the master wanted to keep an eye on his human property, even when they was sleeping. Each cabin wasn't much bigger than a horse stall, housing sometimes 6 or 8 people with nothing but corn shuck mattresses and whatever rags they could piece together for covers. But in them humble cabins, behind walls that couldn't keep out the cold or the rain, lived more dignity and humanity than ever graced the big house. Folk shared what little they had, looked after each other's children when sickness or punishment separated families, and kept alive the songs and stories that connected them to their ancestors across the water. The fields stretched out beyond the quarters like a green sea of bondage. Cotton fields white with bolls that had to be picked till your fingers bled and your back screamed for mercy. Rice fields in the low places where the water stood and the mosquitoes swarmed thick as clouds. Tobacco fields where the plants grew tall and the leaves had to be handled just so. Or the master would dock your rations and add lashes to your back. Work started before dawn and didn't end till the sun set, 6 days a week from can see to can't see. Sundays was for praise meetings and mending clothes and trying to remember what it felt like to be human instead of machinery that happened to breathe. The punishment cellar I told you about sat behind the overseer's house, dug into the ground like a grave for the living. The door was thick oak bound with iron, and once it closed above your head, the world disappeared. They'd throw you down them stone steps with whatever chains the master thought you deserved, and there you'd stay till he decided you'd learned your lesson or died trying. Many a proud spirit had been broken in that cellar. Many a strong back had been bent. Many a bright mind had been dimmed by the darkness and the damp and the weight of iron pressing down on human bones. But the cellar had never held anyone quite like Emily. The plantation ran on a careful balance of fear and necessity. The white folks needed their slaves to work, but they also needed them to be afraid. Too much comfort, and the enslaved might start getting ideas above their station. Too much cruelty, and they might decide death was better than bondage and cause all sorts of expensive trouble. Master Whitmore prided himself on finding that balance, on knowing just how far he could push before something snapped. He'd walk through the quarters sometimes in the evening, hands clasped behind his back, inspecting his human property like a man looking over livestock. He'd stop and ask questions about the work, about any complaints, about anyone who might be causing trouble. Most folk knew to keep their heads down and their mouths shut when the master came calling. They'd say yes, massa, and no massa, and wait for him to move on to torment somebody else. They understood that survival meant invisibility, that the safest slave was the one the master never really noticed. But Emily had never learned that particular lesson. When Master Whitmore looked at her, she looked back. When he spoke to her, she answered with her head up and her voice clear. She was respectful but not servile, obedient but not broken, and something about that balance of pride and compliance ate at the master like acid on metal. He began to watch her more carefully, to take note of the way other slaves deferred to her judgment, the way she carried herself like she was somebody instead of something. He saw how she'd comfort a crying child or tend a sick elder without being told, how she'd share her meager rations with someone who had less, how she'd sing the old songs with such power that even the white folks would stop and listen. And slowly, like poison seeping into a well, an idea began to form in Master Whitmore's mind. An idea about how to break this proud woman, how to teach her and everyone else that no slave, no matter how dignified, could stand against the absolute power of white authority. He began to plan, began to think about what demand he could make that would force Emily to choose between her principles and her safety. He wanted to create a situation where she'd have to betray everything she believed in or face consequences so terrible that other slaves would never dare follow her example. The stage was set, children. The trap was being laid. And Emily, faithful to her nature, walked forward into destiny with her head held high and her spirit unbroken. She didn't know it yet, but tomorrow would bring the test that would change everything. For her, for the plantation, and for every soul who heard her story in the years to come. The old ones always said the darkest hour comes just before dawn. But they never said anything about what happens when dawn doesn't come at all, when the darkness stretches on for 90 days and nights, and the only light that survives is the one burning in a human heart that refuses to be extinguished. That light was about to be tested like gold in the fire, and whether it would emerge purified or be consumed entirely, only the Lord above and the ancestors below could say. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. Lord have mercy on what I'm about to tell you, 'cause this here part of the story gonna make your blood run cold, and your heart cry out for justice that didn't come quick enough. The day that changed Emily's fate forever started like any other day in that place of bondage, with the plantation bell ringing before dawn, and folks stirring in their cabins like spirits waking from uneasy dreams. Emily was up before the bell, same as always, kneeling by her corn-shuck mattress, whispering prayers to ancestors she'd never met, but whose blood ran strong in her veins. She could feel something heavy in the air that morning, like the weight that settles before a storm breaks. The old root doctor had warned her the night before, seen it in the way the chickens wouldn't settle, in the way the dogs kept howling at something nobody else could see. "Trouble coming," he'd whispered, shaking his grizzled head. "Big trouble, and it got your name written all over it, child." Emily had finished her morning prayers and was fixing to head to the big house where she was supposed to help serve breakfast when young Master Robert come stomping through the quarters like he owned every breath of air, which, truth be told, he believed he did. Behind him walked Jake Morrison, the overseer, grinning like a possum eating garbage, and two of them paddy rollers they kept around to chase down runaways and keep the enslaved folk in line. "Emily!" Young Massa's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Get yourself over here, girl. Got something needs doing." Now Emily, she walked over with that careful dignity she always carried, head up but not too high, eyes respectful but not cowering. She could feel every soul in them quarters watching, could sense the fear rising off her people like heat off summer pavement. Whenever young Massa came to the quarters this early, it meant somebody was about to suffer. "Yes, sir, Master Robert," Emily said, her voice steady as ancient oak. "What you need me to do?" Young Massa looked her up and down like she was livestock at market, and something ugly twisted in his pale blue eyes. He'd been nursing a particular hatred for Emily ever since she'd refused his advances the winter before. Not with words, 'cause that would have meant the whip or worse, but with a look that told him clear as daylight that she'd rather die than let him touch her. "See that gal there?" He pointed to a young woman named Ruth, barely 16 years old and heavy with her first child. Ruth was sweet as honeysuckle and gentle as morning rain, one of them souls that suffered in silence and never caused no trouble for nobody. She'd been lazy lately, been dragging her feet in the fields, complaining about being tired all the time. Emily looked over at Ruth, saw the girl's eyes wide with terror, saw how her hands instinctively went to protect her swollen belly. Emily knew what was coming, could feel it in her bones like folks feel earthquake before the ground starts shaking. "Now, Emily," young Massa continued, his voice sweet as poisoned honey, "I want you to teach this lazy gal a lesson. I want you to take this here strap." He held up a thick leather belt with metal studs, and give her 20 lashes across her back. Show her what happens when she don't work hard enough for the family that feeds her and keeps her. The words hit Emily like cold water thrown in her face. Around the quarters she could hear intake of breath, could feel her people's hearts breaking for what they knew she was about to face. 20 lashes with that studded strap would likely kill Ruth's baby, and maybe Ruth herself, and they wanted Emily to be the hand that dealt death. "Master Robert," Emily said carefully, her voice still steady though her heart was beating like African drums, "that gal Ruth is with child. She ain't lazy, she just carrying heavy and needin' rest. Maybe if you could see fit to give her lighter duties till the baby comes." "Did I ask for your opinion, girl?" Young Massa's voice went sharp as broken glass. "Did I ask you to think? I told you to whip her, and that's what you're gonna do. Unless you think you know better than your masters how to run this plantation." Morrison stepped forward, hand on his own whip, eyes bright with the possibility of violence. "Want me to encourage her cooperation, Master Robert?" Emily stood there in that moment between heartbeats, between one breath and the next, knowing that everything she said next would determine not just her fate, but maybe the fate of every soul in them quarters. She could feel the spirits of her ancestors gathering round her, could hear her mama's voice whispering the words she'd spoke all them years ago. "Child, you survive. You survive to tell what I never could. But survival at what cost? Survival by dealing death to another sister. Survival by becoming the master's instrument of cruelty." "Master Robert," Emily said, and her voice carried a strength that surprised even her. "I can't do what you askin'. I won't lift my hand against that girl or her unborn child. You want somebody whipped? You're gonna have to find somebody else to do your devil's work." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Young Mass's face went red as fresh blood, and Morrison took a step back like he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. In all their years of owning human beings, neither one of them had ever heard a slave refuse a direct order so clearly, so completely, so fearlessly. "What did you say?" Young Mass's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than if he'd been shouting. "I said I won't do it," Emily repeated, and now she did look him straight in the eye, no longer caring about the consequences. "That girl ain't done nothing wrong but carry life inside her body, and I ain't gonna be the one to murder that child just 'cause you want to prove how much power you got over folks who can't fight back." Young Mass's hand went to the pistol at his hip, and for a moment Emily thought he might shoot her dead right there in front of everybody. But then she saw something else flicker in his eyes, a calculating look, like he'd just realized he had something better than a quick death planned for her. "You refuse to obey a direct order from your master?" he asked, his voice getting calm in a way that made Emily's blood run cold. "Yes, sir, I refuse. And you understand what that means?" "Yes, sir, I understand." Young Massa smiled then, and it was the kind of smile a snake might wear if snakes could smile. "Good. Morrison, take this rebellious wench to the punishment cellar. See that she's properly secured. I think 90 days ought to be enough time for her to reconsider her position." Morrison stepped forward with them heavy chains already in his hands, like he'd been expecting this outcome all along. But before he could lay hands on Emily, she turned to face the gathered slaves, her people, her family of the heart. "Y'all remember what you seen here today," she called out, her voice carrying clear across the quarters. "Y'all remember that there's some things worth suffering for, some lines you don't cross no matter what they threaten to do to you. And when they try to make you forget your own humanity, you remember that we ain't animals to be broken. We're children of the Most High God, and our souls belong to Him alone." "Shut her up," young Massa snarled, and Morrison brought the butt of his whip down across Emily's head, dropping her to her knees. But even as the blood ran down her face, even as they dragged her away from the only family she'd ever known, Emily kept her eyes on Ruth. The pregnant girl was crying now, hands pressed to her belly, knowing that Emily was fixing to suffer for her sake. "Take care of that baby," Emily called out as they hauled her toward the punishment cellar. "Raise that child to know freedom, even if he's born in bondage. Freedom of the heart, freedom of the spirit. That's the kind of freedom they can't chain up." The last thing Emily saw before they threw her down into that pit of darkness was Ruth nodding through her tears, placing one hand on her belly and the other over her heart, making a promise that would outlast the plantation, outlast slavery itself, outlast every soul who witnessed that day. And as the heavy door slammed shut above Emily's head, cutting off the light like a blade cutting life from death, she whispered one last prayer to the spirits who'd carried her this far. "Give me strength for what's coming. Give me strength to survive not just with my body, but with my soul intact. And if I got to die in this hole, let my death mean something. Let it be testimony that there's some things in this world that can't be bought or sold or beaten into submission." The darkness swallowed her words, but somewhere in that blackness the ancestors whispered back, "We hear you, daughter. We're with you. And this ain't where your story ends. It's where your legend begins. Sweet Jesus, gather close now, 'cause what I'm about to tell you, gonna make your soul cry out for mercy. That wasn't nowhere to be found that terrible night." The sun was hanging low in the western sky like it was ashamed to witness what was about to happen, and the Spanish moss hung still as grave clothes from them cypress trees. Emily walked to that punishment cellar with her head held high, but every step felt like walking toward her own execution. Behind her, Morrison and them patty rollers followed like buzzards circling carrion, and behind them came young Master Robert, his face still twisted with the kind of rage that comes when somebody challenges the natural order of things as you understand them. The cellar door stood open like the mouth of hell itself, and from down in that darkness came the smell of human misery, sweat and blood and despair that had soaked into them stone walls over years of broken spirits. The steps leading down was slick with moisture that might have been water or might have been tears, and at the bottom waited iron chains heavy enough to drag a soul straight to perdition. "Strip her," young Massa ordered, his voice cold as winter ground. "I want her to feel every link of them chains against her skin. I want her to remember what defiance costs." Emily stood there in that moment, surrounded by evil men with evil intentions, and felt the presence of her ancestors stronger than she'd ever felt it before. She could almost see them gathering round her, her mama, her grandmother, all the women who'd suffered before her and all the women who'd die in bondage after her. "I can undress myself," Emily said quietly, her dignity intact even in the face of such degradation. "I don't need your dirty hands on me." She removed her rough cotton dress, her thin shift, standing naked not just in body but in spirit before men who saw her as nothing more than property to be disciplined. But even naked, even powerless, Emily radiated a strength that made them patty rollers uncomfortable, and made young Massa even angrier than before. Morrison selected the chains personal-like, running his hands over the cold iron like he was choosing jewelry for a bride. Heavy shackles for her ankles, connected by a chain so short she'd barely be able to take half a step. Manacles for her wrists, linked to a collar that would go round her neck like the yoke they put on oxen. "This here's special iron," Morrison said, holding up the collar with something like pride. "Had it made by the blacksmith in town. Weighs near 30 pounds all by itself. Won't no woman be standing up straight with this round her neck?" They forced Emily down them slippery steps, and with each step the darkness closed in tighter. The air got thicker, the walls pressed closer. At the bottom, in that pit that had swallowed so many proud spirits, they began the work of chaining her like she was a wild animal. The collar went on first, cold iron pressing against the pulse in her neck, heavy enough to make her shoulders ache immediate-like. Then the wrist shackles, tight enough to cut off her circulation if she moved wrong. Finally, the ankle chains, short enough that she'd have to shuffle like an old woman if she wanted to move at all. "Comfortable?" young Massa asked, standing at the top of them steps looking down at Emily like she was something that had crawled out from under a rock. "Got everything you need for a nice long stay?" Emily didn't answer. Couldn't answer with that iron collar pressing on her throat. But her eyes, Lord have mercy, her eyes spoke volumes. They said she wasn't broken. They said she'd rather die in chains than live in submission. They said that all the iron in creation couldn't weigh down a spirit that belonged to God. 90 days, young Massa continued. "That's how long you gonna sit down there thinking about what happens when you defy your betters. 90 days to remember that you ain't nothing but property, that your opinions don't matter, that your comfort don't matter, that your life don't matter except as it serves white folks." He nodded to Morrison, who began closing the heavy door. But before it shut complete, young Massa called down one last time. "And Emily, that pregnant gal Ruth, she gonna get them 20 lashes anyway. Only difference is, now she gonna know that you couldn't save her. She gonna know that your rebellion didn't mean nothing except more suffering for everybody." The door slammed shut with a sound like thunder, and darkness fell over Emily like a burial shroud. The silence was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the blood pumping through the veins in her ears, could hear the chains settling with tiny metallic sounds as she tried to find a position that didn't cause agony. The cellar was maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with a ceiling so low that even sitting down, Emily's head nearly touched the stone above. The floor was dirt, packed hard by the bodies of all who'd suffered there before her, and it was cold, cold that seeped through skin and muscle, and settled in the bones like winter that never ended. But the worst thing, the thing that made strong men break and proud women weep, was the darkness. Not just absence of light, but presence of shadow so thick it seemed alive, seemed to press against you, like hands trying to smother you. In that darkness, your mind began to play tricks, began to see things that wasn't there, began to hear voices of the dead and the dying. Emily pressed her back against the stone wall and tried to breathe normal-like, tried to keep her mind clear and her spirit strong. She thought about Ruth, hoped the girl was still alive, prayed that young Massa had been lying about giving her them lashes anyway. She thought about her people back in the quarters, wondering if they was praying for her, or if they thought she was a fool for throwing her life away for principle. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time moved different in that place of darkness. Emily's body began to ache from the weight of the chains, began to cramp from not being able to stretch out proper-like. Her throat was dry as dust, her belly empty as a broken promise, but worse than the physical pain was the knowledge that this was only the beginning. 90 days stretched out before her like a road leading straight to hell, and she had to travel every step of it in darkness and iron, with nothing but her faith and her memories to keep her company. But Emily had been raised on stories of ancestors who'd survived the Middle Passage, who'd endured horrors that would have killed lesser spirits. She had been taught that suffering was not the end of the story, that pain was not the final word, that as long as a soul could remember its own name and its own worth, no earthly power could truly destroy it. So she began to sing, quiet-like at first, just under her breath, but gradually louder as she remembered that music was one thing they couldn't chain up, one thing that belonged to her and her alone. She sang the old songs, the ones that carried coded messages of hope and resistance, the ones that connected her to every enslaved soul who'd ever dreamed of freedom. Swing low, sweet chariot, her voice echoed off them stone walls, comin' for to carry me home. And somewhere in that darkness, somewhere beyond the reach of chains and walls and master's cruelty, Emily felt her ancestors stirring, felt them gathering strength for what was coming, felt them whispering promises that 90 days was nothing compared to eternity, that iron shackles was nothing compared to the bonds of love that connected the living to the dead. The first night in that cellar was the longest night of Emily's life, but it wasn't the hardest. The hardest nights was still coming, when hunger would gnaw at her belly like a living thing, when thirst would make her tongue swell and her lips crack, when the weight of them chains would make her shoulders scream and her neck ache like somebody was stranging her slow. But on that first night, with the memory of her refusal still fresh in her mind and the knowledge that she'd stood up for what was right still warm in her heart, Emily sang her songs of resistance and waited for dawn that wouldn't come, for light that was forbidden, for hope that lived not in her circumstances but in her unbreakable soul. The cellar had swallowed many spirits, but Emily's spirit was different. It was made of stronger stuff, forged in the fires of ancestral memory, and tempered by a faith that ran deeper than any pit they could dig. And though she didn't know it yet, that spirit was about to be tested in ways that would transform her from a woman into a force of nature, from a victim into an instrument of divine justice. The darkness pressed close, but it couldn't touch the light burning inside Emily's chest, the light her mama had placed there, the light the ancestors had fed with their sacrifice, the light that would burn bright for 90 days and 90 nights until it was time for reckoning. Lord of glory, let me tell you about that first dawn that never came, about the morning light that couldn't reach down into that pit of human misery where Emily lay chained like a beast. Up above, the sun was rising over the plantation same as always, touching the white columns of the big house with gold, warming the faces of the free folk who could walk where they pleased and breathe air that belonged to them. But down in that cellar, time had stopped. Day and night meant nothing when you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face, when the darkness was so thick you could almost chew it, when the only way you knew you was still alive was the pain in your bones and the beat of your heart against them iron chains. Emily had spent that first night singing and praying, but when what should have been morning came and went without no change in that absolute blackness, when her mouth got dry as cotton and her stomach started gnawing at itself like a hungry animal, that's when the real test began. She tried to shift position, tried to ease the terrible weight of that collar pressing down on her neck, but every movement sent fire shooting through her shoulders and back. Them ankle chains was so short she couldn't straighten her legs, couldn't lie down proper, couldn't do nothing but crouch in that cramped space like she was already in her grave. "Mama," she whispered into the darkness, her voice sounding strange and hollow off them stone walls. "Mama, If you can hear me, send me strength. Send me something to hold on to when this darkness starts eating at my mind." And sure as I'm telling you this story, she felt something shift in that cellar, felt a presence that wasn't her own settling into the shadows. Maybe it was her mama's spirit. Maybe it was the ancestors. Maybe it was the Lord himself taking pity on one of his children in distress. But whatever it was, it brought with it the faintest whisper of comfort, like a cool hand touching a fevered forehead. That comfort didn't last long, though, 'cause that's when her body started telling her exactly what 90 days in hell was gonna feel like. Her throat was parched something terrible, and every swallow felt like swallowing sand. Her stomach cramped and twisted, reminding her that she hadn't had nothing to eat since yesterday morning, and wouldn't be getting nothing regular like for the next 3 months. The smell in that cellar was enough to make a strong man sick. Old sweat, old fear, old blood soaked into stone that had heard too many prayers and seen too many tears. It was the smell of human degradation, of spirits broken and bodies pushed past endurance, of hope dying slow in the dark. But Emily was made of different clay than most folk. She'd been shaped by her mama's hands and her grandmother's wisdom, fired in the kiln of slavery but never broken by it. So when the darkness started pressing in on her mind, when the silence got so heavy she thought it might crush her skull, she reached deep into her memory for the things that belonged to her, and her alone. She remembered her mama's voice, singing the old songs while they worked side by side in some master's kitchen years ago. She remembered the root doctor teaching her about herbs and healing, about which plants could cure and which could kill, about how the earth held medicine for them that knew how to ask for it proper. Most of all, she remembered the stories. Stories about warriors who fought against impossible odds, about women who hid their strength behind humble faces until the moment came to strike, about folks who'd rather die free than live in chains, even if that freedom only lasted for a few precious heartbeats. "Tell me again about Nanny of the Maroons," she whispered to the darkness, repeating words her mama had spoke when Emily was just a little bitty thing. "Tell me about the warrior woman who led her people into the mountains and made the white folks so scared they had to make peace with her." And in her mind, she could hear her mama's voice, could see that strong black face lined with years of suffering but never broken by it. "Child, Nanny was born a slave same as you, but she had something inside her chest that couldn't be owned. When the time came, she gathered up all the folks who was tired of bowing down, and she led them into the hills where the white man's dogs couldn't track them, and his guns couldn't reach them." The story unfolded in Emily's memory like a flower blooming in her heart, giving her something to hold on to when the chains got heavy and the darkness pressed close. She thought about Nanny standing on some mountain peak, free air filling her lungs, sun touching her face, surrounded by people who called her leader instead of property. Hours crawled by like wounded animals. Emily's body was telling her it was thirsty, hungry, hurting in places she didn't even know could hurt. But her spirit was flying free, visiting all them places and times when black folks had said no more, and meant it, when they'd chosen dignity over safety, principle over survival. She thought about Denmark Vesey, planning his rebellion in Charleston, meeting with other brave souls in secret, dreaming of a day when every slave in South Carolina would rise up at once and break their chains with their own hands. She thought about Nat Turner, seeing visions in the sky, believing that God himself had called him to be an instrument of justice in a world gone wrong with cruelty. "They killed them both," she whispered to the stone walls, "hung them high for daring to dream of freedom. But they couldn't kill the dream itself, couldn't chain up the idea that we got the right to be free." Time moved strange in that place. What felt like hours might have been minutes. What felt like days might have been hours. Emily's mind started playing tricks on her, started seeing things moving in the darkness, started hearing voices that might have been memories or might have been spirits or might have been the first signs that her sanity was beginning to crack. But every time the darkness got too heavy, every time she felt like she might lose herself in that pit of despair, she'd start singing again. Not loud. She didn't have the strength for loud, but steady, like her voice was a rope she could climb to get out of the deepest parts of hell. "Sometimes I feel like a motherless child," she sang, and the words echoed back to her changed, like the cellar itself was harmonizing with her pain. "A long way from home, a long way from home." The first day in darkness was ending. though Emily couldn't tell day from night in that place. Somewhere up above, the sun was setting over the plantation. The slaves was finishing their work and heading back to the quarters, and young Master Robert was probably sitting down to his supper, thinking about the woman chained up beneath his feet and feeling satisfied with his cruelty. But down in that cellar, Emily was learning something important. She was learning that the body could be chained, but the spirit couldn't. That the darkness could hide her from the world, but it couldn't hide the world from her memory. That iron could weigh down her flesh, but it couldn't touch the part of her that was made in God's image. The first day was ending, but 89 more stretched out ahead of her like a road through hell. 89 more days of hunger and thirst and pain. 89 more days of darkness so thick it felt alive. 89 more days of testing whether a human soul could survive what no human soul should ever have to endure. But Emily was ready. Not because she was stronger than other folks, but because she carried inside her chest all the strength of all the folks who'd come before her, all the prayers of all the mothers who'd watched their children sold away, all the hope of all the people who'd died dreaming of freedom. She settled back against that cold stone wall, feeling the weight of them chains like the weight of history itself, and whispered one more prayer into the darkness. Lord, I don't know if I'm going to live through this. I don't know if my body's strong enough or my mind's tough enough for what's coming. But I know this much. If you bring me through, if you let me see daylight again, I'm going to make sure my suffering means something. I'm going to make sure they remember that there's some things worth dying for. Some lines you don't cross no matter what they threaten to take from you. The darkness swallowed her words, but somewhere in that silence the ancestors was listening, was gathering strength for what was coming, was preparing to pour out their power through a woman who'd chosen principle over survival and found something stronger than both. The first day in darkness was ending, but Emily's story was just beginning. And though she couldn't know it yet, every minute of suffering in that cellar was forging her into something new, something powerful, something that would shake the foundations of slavery itself. The chains was heavy, but they was also temporary. The darkness was deep, but it wasn't eternal. And the woman who would emerge from that pit after 90 days would be someone even the ancestors hadn't seen before. Someone terrible and beautiful, someone broken and reborn, someone who carried justice in her hands like Moses carried the tablets of the law. But all that was still to come. For now there was only darkness, only iron, only a woman's voice singing songs of resistance into the night, keeping alive a flame that all the cruelty in the world couldn't extinguish. Her mama had told her to survive, to live long enough to tell the story, and Emily was fixing to do exactly that, no matter what it cost her, no matter how deep the darkness got, no matter how heavy them chains pressed down on her unbreakable soul. The first day was ending, but the legend of Emily of the Chains was just beginning to be born in blood and iron and unquenchable hope. Sweet Lord above, how do I tell you about them 90 days that passed like 90 years? Like 90 lifetimes of suffering crammed into one woman's breaking body. How do I paint you a picture of darkness so complete it had weight, of silence so heavy it pressed down on your soul like a gravestone? Listen close now, 'cause this here's the part of Emily's story that most folk can't bear to hear. The part that shows what the human spirit can endure when it's got no choice but to endure or die. After that first day in the cellar, time stopped having any meaning for Emily. Was it morning? Was it night? Had hours passed? Or days? The darkness was so thick she couldn't see her own hand when she held it up to her face. The only sounds was her own breathing, the rattle of chains when she tried to shift position, and sometimes, Lord have mercy, the sounds that came up from the earth itself, like the ground was moaning with all the pain that had soaked into it over the years. The hunger came first, gnawing at her belly like a living thing with teeth and claws. Her stomach twisted and cramped, making sounds like a wounded animal, reminding her with every pang that she was still alive, still suffering, still trapped in that pit of human misery. The thirst was worse, though. Her tongue swelled up in her mouth, her lips cracked and bled, and every breath felt like swallowing fire. Every few days, or what felt like days in that timeless place, they'd lower down a bucket of water that tasted like it had been scooped from a muddy ditch, along with some scraps of bread gone moldy and meat so rotten even the dogs wouldn't eat it. Emily ate it anyway, 'cause the body wants to live even when the mind is ready to give up, even when every bite tastes like shame and desperation. The chains never stopped hurting. That iron collar round her neck got heavier every day, pressing down on her shoulders till her whole back was one long scream of pain. The shackles on her wrists rubbed her skin raw, and then rubbed the raw places bloody, and then rubbed the bloody places down to the bone. Her ankles swelled up so bad around them leg irons that the metal disappeared into her flesh, like it was growing there. But the worst thing, the thing that near broke Emily's mind complete, was the way that darkness started playing tricks on her. After weeks without light, without seeing anything but black pressing in from all sides, her eyes began making up their own pictures. She'd see faces in the shadows, faces of people she'd known, faces of strangers, faces that might have been angels or might have been demons. She'd hear voices calling her name, calling for help, whispering secrets in languages she didn't understand. Sometimes she thought she saw her mama standing in the corner of that cellar, arms outstretched like she was ready to gather Emily up and carry her home. Sometimes she saw the faces of all the slaves who died in that plantation over the years, standing around her like she was already dead, and they was welcoming her to whatever came after. And sometimes, God forgive her, she saw young Master Robert laughing at her suffering, telling her that this was just the beginning of what happened to uppity slaves who forgot their place. The rats came regularly, bold as brass, running over her legs and arms like she was just another piece of cellar furniture. At first, she tried to fight them off, tried to kick at them with her chained feet, but after a while she was too weak to care. Let them come, she thought. Let them eat what they wanted. Maybe they'd eat enough of her that the pain would finally stop. Her body started betraying her in ways that would have shamed her if she'd had any shame left. She couldn't control when her bladder emptied or her bowels moved, couldn't keep herself clean, couldn't do nothing but lie in her own filth and try to remember what it felt like to be human instead of animal. The smell got so bad she stopped noticing it, stopped caring about anything except the next breath, the next heartbeat, the next moment of existing in a world that seemed determined to crush every bit of dignity out of her. But Emily had something inside her that wouldn't die. Call it stubbornness, call it faith, call it the accumulated strength of every ancestor who'd suffered before her. Whatever it was, it kept her alive when she should have died, kept her sane when she should have lost her mind, kept her spirit burning when everything else was being eaten away by darkness and despair. She sang when she had the strength for singing. When her voice was too weak for songs, she hummed. When she couldn't hum, she whispered prayers. And when she couldn't even whisper, she thought the words, holding on to them like they was ropes thrown down into the pit where she was drowning. Wade in the water, she'd sing when the fever dreams got too strong, when the faces in the darkness got too real, when she started forgetting who she was and why she was suffering. Wade in the water, children. God's gonna trouble the water. And sometimes in the space between sleeping and waking, between consciousness and madness, Emily could swear she felt that water, cool and clean and flowing, washing away the filth and the pain and the weight of them iron chains. She could feel herself walking into that river, feel the current taking hold of her, carrying her away from the plantation and the cellar and all the cruelty that had brought her to this place. But then she'd wake up, if you could call it waking when there was no light to wake up to, and she'd still be chained in that pit, still suffering, still breathing air that tasted like death and despair. The nights was the worst. Not that she could tell night from day in that place, but there was something about the deep hours when even the world above went quiet that made the darkness press closer, made the chains feel heavier, made the voices in her head whisper louder. That's when she'd see her mama clearest, when the woman who'd birthed her and raised her would seem to sit down next to her in that filth and hold her like she was still a little child. "Mama," Emily would whisper, reaching out to touch a face that wasn't there. "Mama, I tried to be strong like you taught me. I tried to stand up for what was right, but I don't know if I can hold on much longer. This pain is eating me alive, and I'm starting to forget. I'm starting to forget who I am." And in her fever dreams, her mama would answer back, "Child, you ain't forgotten nothing important. You remember love, don't you? You remember what it feels like to choose right over easy. You remember that you got people counting on you to survive this, to come out the other side and tell them that the human spirit can't be broken? But Mama, I am broken. Look at me. I'm lying in my own waste, talking to ghosts, barely remembering my own name some days. Baby girl, Being broken ain't the same as being defeated. Sometimes a thing got to be broken complete before it can be put back together stronger. You think them chains can hold the woman you're becoming? You think that cellar can contain the story you're going to tell? Weeks passed, or months. Time had lost all meaning in that place where the sun never shone. Emily's body wasted away till she was nothing but skin stretched over bones, till the chains hung loose on her wrists, and the collar rattled around her neck like jewelry on a skeleton. Her hair fell out in patches, her teeth loosened in her head. Her skin took on the gray color of something that had been buried too long. But her eyes, Lord have mercy, her eyes still burned. Burned with something that all the cruelty in creation couldn't put out. Something that got brighter as her body got weaker. Something that was waiting for its moment to shine. She started having visions during them long dark hours. Visions that might have been madness or might have been prophecy. Or might have been the Lord himself showing her things that was yet to come. She saw herself walking out of that cellar, not broken, but transformed. Not defeated, but purified like gold in the fire. She saw young Master Robert's face pale with fear instead of red with rage. She saw water, lots of water, dark and deep and hungry for justice. Something's coming. She'd whisper to the rats in the darkness and the chains that had become her only companions. Something's coming, and when it gets here, y'all gonna remember the name Emily. Gonna remember it long after this plantation crumbles to dust and them that built it are forgotten. The visions got stronger as the days wore on, more real than the reality of pain and hunger and darkness. She could see herself rising up from that cellar like Lazarus rising from the tomb, could feel the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders, heavier than any iron chain. The ancestors was preparing her for something, filling her up with power that her wasted body couldn't contain much longer. And still the days passed. Still the bread came moldy, and the water came dirty. Still the rats ran bold across her legs, and the darkness pressed close like a living thing. Still the chains rubbed her raw, and the collar bent her neck, and the ankle shackles kept her crouched like an animal in a cage. But Emily endured. Endured because she had to. Because her mama's ghost wouldn't let her give up. Because somewhere up above the ground, Ruth was raising her baby and telling that child stories about the woman who'd chosen to suffer rather than cause suffering. Endured because every day she stayed alive was another day that young Master Robert didn't get to see her broken. Another day that the spirit of resistance kept burning in that God-forsaken place. 80 days, 85 days, 90 days drawing near like a storm building on the horizon. And Emily, near dead but somehow still alive, chained in darkness but somehow still seeing clearly, began to understand that her time in that cellar wasn't punishment. It was preparation. Preparation for what was coming when that door finally opened, and young Master Robert came down to see what was left of the woman who dared defy him. Preparation for the moment when all that suffering would transform itself into something terrible and beautiful, something that would shake the foundations of slavery itself and leave a mark on the world that time couldn't erase. The darkness had tried to swallow Emily whole, but instead of destroying her, it had forged her into something new. Something that carried justice in its hands and vengeance in its heart. Something that them chains couldn't hold much longer. The 90 days was almost over, but Emily's real story was just beginning. And when it was finished, when the last chapter was written in blood and water and unbreakable will, folks would remember her name long after they'd forgotten the names of her tormentors. The cellar had tried to make her forget who she was, but instead, it had shown her who she was becoming. And what she was becoming would make the earth tremble and the river run red with justice. Lord Almighty, prepare your hearts for what I'm fixin' to tell you, 'cause this here's the day when hell opened up and spit out something that even the devil himself wouldn't claim. 90 days had passed. 90 days of Emily rotting in that pit like forgotten fruit. 90 days of young Master Robert thinking he'd broken the spirit of the most defiant slave who'd ever dared look him in the eye. He came down on a Tuesday morning, though Emily couldn't tell Tuesday from Sunday in that timeless darkness, whistling like a man going to check on his prize hogs, his boots echoing off them stone steps like the footsteps of judgment itself. Behind him walked Morrison the overseer, carrying a lantern that threw wild shadows on the walls and made the cellar look like the mouth of some great beast ready to swallow them whole. Young Massa had been thinking about this moment for weeks, savoring it like fine wine. Imagining what he'd find when he opened that door, he expected to see a broken woman, maybe dead, maybe mad, but certainly humbled, certainly ready to beg forgiveness for her defiance and promise never to question white authority again. What he found was something else entirely. Emily was still chained in the corner where they'd left her, but the woman who looked up at that lamplight wasn't the same person who'd been thrown down there 3 months before. This woman was lean as a hunting wolf, her skin stretched tight over bones that showed sharp as knife blades, her hair gone white as cotton in patches where it hadn't fallen out entirely. Her body had been consumed by suffering, carved away until nothing was left but sinew and will. But her eyes, sweet Jesus, her eyes was like looking into the furnace where God forges justice. They burned with something that made young Massa take a step back without knowing why, something that made Morrison's hand shake so bad the lantern light danced across the walls like spirits fleeing from what they'd witnessed. "Well, well," young Massa said, trying to sound confident but his voice cracking like a boy's. "Look what we have here, the high and mighty Emily, brought low at last. How you feeling down there in the dark, girl? You ready to apologize for your disobedience? Ready to admit that white folks know better than slaves what's good for them?" Emily didn't answer immediate-like. Couldn't answer, truth be told, 'cause her throat was so raw from thirst and screaming into the darkness that words came hard. But when she finally spoke, her voice carried something that made both men's blood run cold. Not weakness, not submission, but power that had been refined in the fires of suffering until it was pure as lightning. "Master Robert," she said, each word slow and deliberate like she was speaking prophecy instead of conversation. "I've been waiting for you." The words hung in that cellar like smoke from a funeral pyre. Young Massa laughed, but it was the kind of laugh you make when you're scared and trying to hide it, when something deep in your gut is telling you to run but your pride won't let you. "Waiting for me?" He stepped closer, though Morrison held back like a man who could smell danger on the wind. "Well, ain't that sweet? The chained dog is waiting for her master. You ready to heal now? Ready to roll over and show your belly?" Emily shifted in her chains, and the sound of iron against stone echoed through that cellar like thunder before a storm. But it wasn't the sound of submission, it was the sound of something testing its bonds, something measuring the weight of metal against the strength of will. "I've been having dreams," Emily said, her voice getting stronger with each word, like she was drawing power from the very air around her. "Dreams about water, dreams about justice, dreams about white folks learning that some debts got to be paid in full." Young Massa's face went red, then pale, then red again. He wasn't used to slaves talking to him like that, especially not slaves who'd been chained in darkness for 3 months. This was supposed to be his moment of triumph, his chance to gloat over a broken enemy, but something was going wrong. Something was turning his victory into something that tasted like ashes in his mouth. "You been having dreams." He tried to inject mockery into his voice, but it came out shaky. What kind of dreams can a chained animal have? Dreams about begging for scraps? Dreams about knowing your place? Emily looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time in his privileged life, young Master Robert felt what it was like to be truly seen by someone who could read the darkness in his soul. Her eyes moved over his face like she was memorizing every feature, like she was marking him for something terrible and final. "I dreamed about you drowning," she said, and the words dropped into that cellar like stones into deep water. "Dreamed about you going under the dark water and not coming up. Dreamed about these chains round your ankles instead of mine, pulling you down to where the catfish feed and the current runs strong." Morrison made a sound like a man who'd been gut shot, and the lantern in his hand shook so bad the shadows jumped around the walls like demons dancing. But young Massa, he was too proud to show fear, too stupid to recognize truth when it looked him in the face. "Dreams of a mad woman," he sneered, though his voice was getting higher, more strained. 3 months in the dark will do that to you. Make you see things that ain't there. Make you think you got power when you ain't nothing but property in chains." He reached for his keys, the ones that would unlock Emily's shackles, planning to drag her up into the sunlight where he could parade her brokenness in front of all the other slaves, where he could use her as an example of what happened to those who dared defy white authority. But when his fingers touched that iron collar around Emily's neck, something happened that neither man was prepared for. A shock went through young Massa like he'd grabbed hold of lightning, and for just a moment he saw what Emily had been seeing in her dreams, himself under dark water, chains dragging him down, his lungs filling with river mud and his eyes going blank as a doll's. He jerked his hand back like he'd been burned, staring at Emily with something between rage and terror. What did you do to me?" Emily smiled then, and it was the most terrible smile either man had ever seen, beautiful and awful at the same time, like the face of an avenging angel come to collect on a debt of blood. "I didn't do nothing to you, Master Robert. I just showed you what's coming. What's been waiting for you all these years while you've been thinking you was safe behind your white skin and your daddy's money." "She's mad," Morrison whispered, backing toward the steps. 3 months in here has drove her clean out of her mind. We should leave her be, maybe get the preacher to come pray over her." But young Massa was trapped now between his fear and his pride, between the smart thing to do and the thing his nature demanded. He couldn't walk away from a slave who'd threatened him, couldn't let word get out that he'd been intimidated by a chained woman in a cellar. His reputation depended on breaking Emily completely, on reducing her to a groveling thing that would serve as a warning to every other slave on the plantation. Mad? He forced his voice to steady, forced his hands to stop shaking. Maybe so. But mad or sane, she's still property. Still something that belongs to me, something I can do with as I please. He grabbed the keys again, ignoring the way they seemed to burn his fingers, and began unlocking the shackles that had held Emily for so long. First the collar, heavy iron lifting away from her neck like a weight being removed from her soul. Then the wrist manacles, clicking open to reveal flesh rubbed raw and bloody. Finally the ankle chains, falling away to leave Emily free for the first time in 90 days. But freedom, Emily had learned in that dark place, didn't come from the absence of chains. Real freedom came from something deeper, something that had been growing inside her chest during all them days and nights of suffering, something that young Master Robert was about to understand too late. Emily stood up slow, her legs shaky from months of disuse, her body weak from hunger and abuse. But there was something in the way she moved, something in the way she held herself, that made both men take a step back. She looked like what she was, a woman who had been to hell and back, who had seen the worst that human cruelty could offer, and had somehow transformed it into power. "You want to drag me upstairs?" she asked, her voice getting stronger with each word. "Want to show me off to your daddy and the other slaves? Want to prove that you broke the woman who dared say no to you?" Young Massa nodded, not trusting his voice. Emily smiled that terrible smile again. "Good. I've been waiting 3 months to see sunlight again. Been waiting to feel fresh air on my face and solid ground under my feet. You go on ahead, Master Robert. Lead the way. Show me the world I've been missing." But as young Massa turned toward them stone steps, as he began to climb toward daylight and the satisfaction of his victory, he didn't see the look that passed between Emily and the shadows in that cellar. Didn't see the way her fingers moved like she was gathering something from the air itself, something that had been building in that place of suffering for 90 long days and nights. He was thinking about his triumph, about the broken slave he was bringing up from the depths like a trophy of his power. He was thinking about the fear he'd see in other slaves' eyes when they saw what defiance had cost Emily, about the stories that would spread through the quarters, about what happened to those who forgot their place. What he wasn't thinking about was the fact that some things, once broken, become more dangerous than they ever were whole. He wasn't thinking about the power that suffering can forge in a human soul, or the way that injustice can accumulate like water behind a dam until the day it bursts and sweeps away everything in its path. He wasn't thinking about the chains that still lay on that cellar floor, iron links that had held Emily's body, but had somehow transferred their power to her spirit. He wasn't thinking about how those same chains might feel wrapped around his own ankles, dragging him down into dark water where justice waited with the patience of the grave. Young Master Robert climbed them steps, thinking he was leading a defeated enemy into the light. What he was really doing was walking toward the darkest hour of his life, toward a reckoning that had been building for 90 days in the depths below, toward a justice that would be swift and final and terrible as the wrath of God himself. Emily followed behind him, each step taking her closer to fresh air and sunlight, closer to the moment when all her suffering would transform itself into something that would shake the foundations of the world. The cellar had tried to break her, but instead, it had forged her into an instrument of divine justice. And that instrument was about to be used. Sweet Lord in heaven, what I'm about to tell you now is the moment when the natural order of things got turned upside down, when a slave looked at her master, and he saw his own death looking back. Emily came up them cellar steps like she was rising from the grave itself, and every slave on that plantation stopped what they was doing to watch something that had never been seen before, a woman who'd been buried alive coming back to the land of the living with hell still burning in her eyes. The sunlight hit Emily's face like a physical blow after 90 days in absolute darkness. She stumbled, near fell, raised her hands to shield eyes that had forgotten what light looked like. But even squinting, even with tears streaming down her wasted cheeks, she kept her gaze fixed on young Master Robert like she was memorizing every detail of his face for some future purpose that only she understood. Folk gathered round without being called, field hands dropping their hoes, house servants appearing at windows, children peeking out from behind their mamas' skirts. They all knew who was coming up from that cellar. All knew that Emily of the Chains was finally seeing daylight again. But what they saw wasn't what they expected. This wasn't a broken woman. This wasn't a spirit crushed by months of suffering and ready to beg forgiveness for her defiance. This was something new, something that had been forged in darkness and pain until it became harder than the iron that had bound it, more dangerous than the cruelty that had tried to destroy it. Emily stood there swaying in the morning light, her body weak as a newborn colt's, but her presence filling the air like thunder before lightning strikes. Her dress hung in rags. Her skin was marked with scars and sores from the chains. Her hair had gone white in patches where it hadn't fallen out entirely. She looked like death itself, but death with purpose, death with a mission that wouldn't be denied. Young Master Robert was feeling mighty pleased with himself, thinking he'd accomplished something grand. He turned to face the assembled slaves, ready to make a speech about what happened to those who forgot their place, ready to use Emily's condition as an example that would keep his human property in line for years to come. "Look here, all of you," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard like a preacher delivering sermon. "Look at what becomes of slaves who think they know better than their masters. 3 months in the dark, 3 months to think about the price of disobedience, 3 months to remember that you are property, not people." He gestured toward Emily like she was an exhibit at a fair, expecting to see submission written across her features, expecting to see the broken spirit that would validate his cruelty and justify his power. But when he looked at her face, when he really looked into them eyes that had seen the depths of human suffering, his words died in his throat like water poured on fire. Emily was looking at him, not down at the ground like slaves was supposed to do, not with the sideways glance of someone afraid to give offense, but straight at him, eye to eye, like she was his equal, or maybe even his better. And there was something in that look, something that made his knees go weak and his heart start beating fast as a rabbit's. It wasn't hatred, though Lord knows Emily had reason enough for hate. It wasn't fear, though she had every reason to be afraid. It was something deeper, something that young Master Robert had never seen in a slave's eyes before. Recognition. Like she was seeing through all his bluster and pretense to the small, cruel, frightened man underneath, seeing him clear as daylight and finding him wanting. "Emily," he said, his voice not as steady as he wanted it to be, "you got something to say to me? Some apology for your rebellious behavior? Some promise that you learned your lesson down there in the dark?" Emily tilted her head slightly, like she was considering his words, like she was trying to remember what language he was speaking. When she finally answered, her voice was rusty from disuse but clear as church bells on Sunday morning. "Master Robert," she said, and every slave in that yard leaned forward to catch her words. "I learned many things down in that cellar. I learned that darkness can teach you to see things that light keeps hidden. I learned that chains on the body can set the spirit free. I learned that some folks think power means making others suffer, but real power comes from choosing how much suffering you're willing to endure for what you believe is right." Young Master Robert's face went red, then white, then red again. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. This wasn't the broken slave begging for mercy that he'd been dreaming about for 3 months. This was something else entirely, something that made him feel like he was the one being judged instead of doing the judging. "You learned?" His voice rose higher than he intended, cracked like a boy going through his changes. You learned. The only thing you should have learned is to keep your mouth shut and do what you're told. You're still my property, still subject to my will, still nothing but a slave who forgot her place. Emily smiled then, and it was the most unsettling thing anyone in that yard had ever seen. It wasn't the smile of submission or the smile of madness. It was the smile of someone who knew a secret, someone who could see the future unfolding like pages in a book, someone who understood that the story was about to take a turn that nobody expected. "Your property?" she said, and there was something almost gentle in her voice, like she was talking to a child who didn't understand the way the world really worked. "Master Robert, look at me. Really look at me. Do I look like someone who can be owned? Do I look like something you can control?" And God help him, young Master Robert did look. Looked at this woman who'd been buried alive for 90 days, who'd survived on rotten bread and dirty water, who'd been chained like an animal in the dark depths of the earth. Looked at her wasted body and her scarred skin, and her hair gone white with suffering. But most of all, he looked at her eyes. And in those eyes, he saw something that made his soul shrink back in terror. He saw his own death. Not the quick death of bullet or blade, but the slow death of drowning, of sinking down into dark water while chains dragged him to the bottom, and his lungs filled with river mud. You've been dreaming again," he whispered, but his voice carried no conviction, having visions like the mad folks do. "Maybe," Emily said, taking a step toward him. Just one step, but it made him back away like she was carrying plague. "Or maybe I've been seeing clear for the first time in my life. Maybe them 90 days in your cellar washed the scales from my eyes, showed me things that light-blinded folks can't see." The other slaves was watching this exchange like they was witnessing the second coming of Christ himself. Never in their lives had they seen a master back away from a slave, never seen white authority questioned so directly, never seen a woman who'd been broken by the system stand up stronger than before. Morrison the overseer was shifting from foot to foot like a man standing on hot coals, his hand moving toward the whip at his belt, but not quite reaching it. Something in Emily's presence made him afraid to make sudden movements, afraid to do anything that might trigger whatever power she'd brought up from that cellar. "Master Robert," Emily said, her voice getting stronger with each word, like she was drawing power from the very air around her. "You brought me up here to show these good folks what happens to slaves who defy their masters. You wanted to break my spirit, make me an example of your power over life and death." Young Master Robert nodded, though he was beginning to understand that his plan had gone wrong somewhere, that the woman standing before him wasn't the broken slave he'd been expecting. "Well then," Emily said, spreading her arms wide like she was embracing the whole world. "Look at me, all of you. Look at what your master's cruelty can accomplish. Look at what 90 days in chains and darkness can create." And every slave in that yard did look, saw a woman who'd been reduced to skin and bones but whose spirit burned brighter than the sun itself, saw someone who'd been to hell and back and brought something terrible and beautiful with her, saw living proof that the human soul couldn't be bought or sold or chained up no matter what masters thought they owned. But Emily wasn't done. She fixed her gaze on young Master Robert again, and this time he couldn't look away, couldn't break the hold that those burning eyes had on his guilty soul. "You want to know what I learned in your cellar?" she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of that yard. "I learned that every chain you put on my body made my spirit stronger. I learned that every day you kept me in darkness made me see clearer. I learned that every cruelty you inflicted just added weight to the debt you owe, the debt that's coming due real soon." Young Master Robert tried to speak, tried to reassert his authority, tried to remember that he was the master and she was the slave and that was the natural order of things. But the words wouldn't come. Because for the first time in his privileged life he was face to face with someone who wasn't afraid of him, someone who saw through all his pretense to the frightened, weak man underneath. "You best get back to work," he finally managed to say to the assembled slaves, but his voice was shaky and uncertain. "All of you, back to what you was doing. This spectacle is over." But nobody moved. They stood there watching Emily like she was Moses come down from the mountain, like she was carrying commandments written in fire and blood, like she was the answer to prayers they'd been whispering in secret for years. Emily looked around at her people, at the faces marked by suffering but not broken by it, At the children who would grow up in bondage but didn't have to grow up without hope. At the men and women who'd learned to survive by keeping their heads down and their spirits hidden. "It ain't over," she said. And though she spoke quiet, her words reached every ear in that yard. "This here's just the beginning. Change is coming like floodwater, like wildfire, like Judgment Day itself. And when it gets here, y'all remember this moment. Remember that one woman said no to the master and lived to tell about it. Remember that chains can't hold what can't be owned, that darkness can't hide what burns with its own light." And she looked at young Master Robert one last time, and in that look was all the suffering he'd caused her, all the dignity he'd tried to steal, all the justice that was waiting for him somewhere down the road. "Your turn coming, Master Robert," she said, her voice soft as a mother's lullaby but carrying the weight of prophecy. "Your turn to learn what it feels like to be powerless, what it feels like to have your fate in somebody else's hands. And when that day comes, you remember that Emily warned you. Remember that I tried to teach you before it was too late." With that, she turned her back on him, turned her back on her master like he was nobody special, like his authority meant nothing, like his power to hurt her had been used up in that cellar. And now she was free in ways that had nothing to do with laws or papers or chains. Young Master Robert stood there watching her walk away, feeling smaller with every step she took, feeling his power drain away like water from a broken bucket. He'd brought her up from that cellar to display his victory, but somehow she'd turned his triumph into her own, had transformed her suffering into strength that made his cruelty look petty and small. The other slaves began to drift away, back to their work, but carrying with them something they'd never had before, the memory of seeing their oppressor look afraid, the knowledge that even the most brutal master was just a man after all, just flesh and blood and fear wrapped up in white skin and false authority. And Emily walked toward the river, her steps getting stronger with each yard between her and the plantation house, her spirit soaring free even though she knew her body was still trapped in the world of slavery. She'd shown them all something that day, shown them that the human spirit couldn't be broken, that dignity couldn't be taken away, that some things were worth any amount of suffering to preserve. But most important of all, she'd looked into young Master Robert's eyes and seen the fear there, seen the knowledge that his time of reckoning was coming, seen that the chains and the cellar and the 90 days of darkness had forged her into something that could bring justice to a world that had forgotten what justice looked like. The river was calling to her, dark water flowing steady and patient, waiting for the day when it would claim what it was owed. And Emily walked toward that water like she was walking toward destiny itself, carrying in her heart the promise of reckoning and the certainty that some debts could only be paid in full. Lord, have mercy on what I'm about to tell you, 'cause this here's the moment when justice stopped being patient and started moving like lightning through the world. Emily walked away from that confrontation with young Master Robert, like she was walking toward her own resurrection, and every soul on that plantation could feel something building in the air, something heavy and electric like the atmosphere before a summer storm tears the sky apart. 3 days passed after Emily came up from that cellar, 3 days when nothing seemed quite right on the Whitmore plantation. Slaves went about their work, but they moved different, carried themselves different, like they'd seen something that changed the way they understood the world. They'd watched one of their own look a white master in the eye and make him blink first, make him back down, make him afraid. Young Master Robert, he tried to go back to normal, tried to pretend that nothing had happened, that he was still the same man with the same power over the lives and deaths of his human property. But something had shifted inside him during that confrontation with Emily, something that made his sleep restless and his hands shake when nobody was looking. He'd taken to drinking more than usual, sitting on the veranda of the big house with a bottle of bourbon and a loaded pistol, watching the quarters like he expected trouble to come walking out of them shadows at any moment. His daddy noticed the change, asked him what was eating at him. But how do you explain to another white man that a slave woman had looked into your soul and found it wanting? Emily, she spent them 3 days down by the river, sitting on the muddy bank with her feet in the water, staring out at the current like she was reading messages written in the flow of tide and time. Folks said she was praying, others said she was conjuring, but anybody with eyes could see she was preparing for something, gathering strength the way a snake gathers itself before it strikes. The old root doctor came to sit with her on the second day, his ancient bones creaking as he lowered himself to the ground beside this woman, who'd been transformed by suffering into something he'd never seen before. "Child," he said, his voice soft as wind through dry leaves, "I've been watching you since you came up from that hole, and I can see the spirits moving around you thick as fog. Something big is coming, ain't it? Something that gonna shake this place down to its foundations." Emily didn't answer immediate-like, just kept staring at that dark water flowing past like time itself, carrying away secrets and bringing new ones downstream. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of prophecy, the certainty of someone who'd seen the future written in blood and water. "Root Doctor," she said, "you remember that story you used to tell about the river spirits? About how they collect debts for the ancestors? About how they wait patient as stone for the day when justice got to be served?" The old man nodded slow, his eyes getting wide as he began to understand what Emily was telling him without saying it direct. "Well," Emily continued, "I've been talking to them spirits, been making arrangements. Some debts is coming due real soon, and the collection gonna be more terrible than anything this plantation ever seen." On the third day, young Master Robert's patience ran out. Maybe it was the bourbon talking. Maybe it was his daddy asking too many questions about why he seemed so jumpy. Maybe it was just the natural cruelty that lived in his heart demanding satisfaction. Whatever it was, he decided that Emily had had enough time to recover from her ordeal, enough time to remember her place and start acting like a proper slave again. He came looking for her just after the dinner bell rang, striding down to the river with Morrison the overseer behind him, and them heavy chains from the cellar coiled in his hands like iron snakes. He'd decided to put Emily back underground, maybe permanently this time, show everybody what happened to slaves who got ideas above their station. Emily was still sitting by the water when they found her, still as a statue carved from dark wood, still staring at that current like she was having a conversation with spirits only she could see. She didn't turn around when she heard their footsteps, didn't acknowledge their presence until young Master Robert was standing right behind her with them chains ready to wrap around her neck again. "Time to go back where you belong," he said, his voice trying to sound confident but carrying an edge of nervousness that even Emily's worn ears could detect. "Had enough fresh air, enough time to think about your sins. Ready to beg forgiveness and promise to be a good slave from now on?" Emily stood up slow, water dripping from her bare feet, mud squelching between her toes. When she turned to face him, young Master Robert took a half step back without meaning to, 'cause something had changed in her face during them 3 days by the river. The woman who'd defied him before had been strong and proud and unbroken. The woman who faced him now was something else entirely, something that carried power in her bones and lightning in her blood. "Master Robert," she said, her voice calm as still water but with undertones that made the hair on his neck stand up. "You bring them chains to put on me again? You think 90 days in your cellar wasn't enough to teach me my proper place?" "More than enough for most," he replied, but his hands was shaking as he lifted them iron shackles. "But you ain't most slaves, are you? You one of them proud ones, them uppity ones that got to be broken complete before they learned to submit." Emily smiled then, and it was the same terrible smile she'd shown him when he'd first come down to the cellar, beautiful and awful like the face of an avenging angel come to settle accounts that had been outstanding too long. "You right about one thing," she said, taking a step toward him instead of away. "I ain't like most slaves. Most slaves ain't been where I been, ain't seen what I seen, ain't learned what them 90 days in darkness taught me." Young Master Robert was getting agitated now, frustrated that Emily wasn't cowering like she was supposed to, wasn't begging and pleading like every other slave he'd ever threatened. His face was turning red, his breathing getting faster, and his grip on them chains was getting tighter. "What you think you learned?" he snarled, raising the shackles like he was fixing to swing them at her head. "What you think 90 days of punishment taught you except that I got the power to make you suffer whenever I please?" Emily's eyes fixed on his face, and for a moment young Master Robert felt like he was falling into deep water, like the ground beneath his feet had turned liquid, and he was sinking down into darkness where things with teeth and claws was waiting to welcome him. "It taught me that suffering ain't punishment," she said, her voice getting stronger with each word. "It taught me that pain is just the forge where strength gets made. It taught me that every chain you put on my body was making my spirit harder, Every day you kept me in darkness was showing me how to see in places where light don't reach. She took another step toward him, and this time young Master Robert couldn't stop himself from backing away. Couldn't fight the instinct that was screaming at him to run from this woman who'd somehow turned his victory into her transformation. Most of all, Emily continued, it taught me that them chains you're holding, them iron shackles you think give you power over me, they can be turned around. They can become weapons instead of bonds, tools of justice instead of instruments of oppression. Before young Master Robert could understand what she meant, before he could react to the deadly certainty in her voice, Emily moved. Fast as striking lightning, smooth as water flowing downhill, she lunged forward and grabbed them chains right out of his hands. The iron felt different in her grip than it had when it was wrapped around her neck and wrists. Instead of weighing her down, it seemed to give her strength, seemed to hum with power that ran up through her arms and into her heart. The very metal that had been used to bind her was now hers to command, transformed from symbol of oppression into instrument of liberation. Young Master Robert stumbled backward, his face gone white as his daddy's cotton, his mouth opening and closing like a fish thrown up on dry land. Morrison reached for his whip, but Emily's eyes fixed on him with such intensity that his hand froze halfway to his belt. "You wanted to chain me again," Emily said, the iron links singing as she swung them through the air, testing their weight, learning their balance. "You wanted to drag me back to that cellar, bury me alive in your darkness one more time. But I told you already, I ain't the same woman who went down into that hole. I'm something new, something you helped create with your cruelty." The chains moved in Emily's hands like they was alive, like they recognized their new master and was eager to serve a different purpose than they'd been forged for. She wrapped one end around her wrist, let the other end hang free, heavy iron that could crush bone or crack skull depending on how it was applied. "These chains," she said, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of an old spiritual, "these chains that held me down gonna lift me up. These chains that bound my body gonna set my spirit free. These chains that was meant to break me gonna be the tools that break you instead." Young Master Robert finally found his voice, high and shrill as a woman's scream. "You threatening me? You threatening a white man? Morrison, shoot her! Shoot her down before she—" But Emily was already moving, the chains whistling through the air as she swung them in a wide arc that caught young Master Robert around the ankles and sent him tumbling to the ground like a felled tree. The sound of his body hitting the earth was wet and final, like the sound of justice being served after a long wait. Morrison went for his pistol then, but Emily's other hand found a link of chain and sent it flying through the air to crack against his wrist. The gun went spinning away into the mud, and Morrison went down screaming and holding his broken bones. Young Master Robert tried to crawl away, tried to untangle himself from the iron coils that Emily had wrapped around his legs, but the harder he struggled, the tighter the chains seemed to bind him. It was like they had a will of their own now, like they was eager to reverse the roles they'd played for so long. "Please," he gasped, all his arrogance gone now, all his master's authority reduced to the pleading of a frightened child. "Please, Emily, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I done to you. Let me go and I swear I'll set you free, give you papers, let you walk away from here." Emily looked down at him with something like pity in her eyes, but it was the kind of pity you might feel for a rabid dog that had to be put down for the safety of everyone around it. "Master Robert," she said, her voice gentle now but no less terrible, "you had your chance to learn mercy, had 90 days to think about what you'd done, what kind of man you was becoming. But instead of learning compassion, you came here with more chains, more cruelty, more of the same poison that's been eating at your soul since the day you was born." She began dragging him toward the river, the chains wrapped around his ankles, making furrows in the muddy ground, his hands clawing at anything that might stop his progress toward that dark water. Behind them, Morrison lay moaning in the dirt, his gun hand useless, watching helplessly as his master was pulled toward a fate that had been written in the stars since the first slave ship crossed the Atlantic. "The river's been waiting for you," Emily said as they reached the bank where she'd spent 3 days preparing for this moment. "Waiting patient as judgment, hungry for the debt you owe. All them tears that was shed in your cellar, all them prayers that went unanswered, all them souls that suffered under your hand, they all been flowing into this water, making it strong enough to carry what's coming." Young Master Robert's struggles grew weaker as he saw that dark current flowing past, saw his own death reflected in the surface like a mirror showing the future. The chains around his ankles was growing heavier, pulling him toward depths where no amount of white privilege could save him, where no family name or inherited wealth could buy him mercy from the justice he'd earned. "Emily," he whispered. One last desperate attempt to find humanity in someone he'd tried so hard to destroy. "Emily, please. I got a wife. Got children. They need me." Emily paused at the water's edge, looking down at the man who'd caused her such suffering, who'd tried to break her spirit and steal her dignity. For a moment, just a moment, something soft flickered in her eyes. Then she remembered Ruth's terrified face, remembered the choice between whipping a pregnant girl or facing punishment herself, remembered 90 days of darkness and chains and pain that would have killed a lesser spirit, remembered all the slaves who'd suffered under this man's cruelty, all the families torn apart by his greed, all the spirits broken by his casual evil. "Your children gonna be better off without you," she said, and began pulling him into the water. "Your wife gonna be free of a man who never learned what love really means, and this plantation gonna have a chance to heal from the poison you and your family been spreading for 3 generations. The water was cold and dark and hungry, reaching up to welcome the offering that Emily was bringing to its depths. The chains that had once bound her body was now dragging her oppressor down to where the catfish fed, and the current ran deep, where justice lived in the silence and the dark. Young Master Robert went under once, came up sputtering and fighting, went under again and stayed down longer. The 3rd time, Emily let go of the chains and watched him sink into that hungry water, watched the river claim what it had been owed for too many years of tears and blood and broken promises. The water closed over his head like a benediction, like a final amen to a prayer that had been whispered by countless suffering souls. And Emily stood on the bank, the remaining chains still in her hands, watching the current carry away the man who'd thought he owned her body and soul. But the river wasn't done with its work yet. There was still Morrison to deal with, still a plantation full of slaves who needed to understand that the day of reckoning had finally come, still a world that needed to learn what happened when you pushed the human spirit too far. Emily turned away from the water, the chains singing in her hands like freedom songs, like spirituals carrying messages of hope and deliverance. The real work was just beginning, but the hardest part was done. The man who'd tried to break her was broken instead, claimed by the same forces he'd tried to use against those who couldn't fight back. Justice had been served cold and deep and final as the grave. And Emily, transformed by suffering into something terrible and beautiful, walked back toward the plantation with chains that was no longer symbols of bondage, but tools of liberation, weapons of righteousness in the hands of someone who'd finally learned to wield them. The water lapped at the muddy bank behind her, carrying secrets downstream, whispering stories of a woman who'd chosen dignity over submission and found power in the very instruments of her oppression. And somewhere in that current, justice flowed patient and implacable toward whatever reckoning was waiting downstream. Sweet Jesus above, how do I tell you about what happened next? About the sight that burned itself into every soul who witnessed it, and would live in their nightmares until they drew their last breath. Emily walking back from that river like an angel of vengeance, chains dragging behind her in the mud, Morrison crawling through the dirt with his broken hand pressed to his chest, and terror written across his pale face like scripture. Word spread through them quarters faster than wildfire in August, faster than news of freedom, faster than any good or bad tidings had ever traveled on that plantation before. Emily done killed the young master, voices whispered in the cotton fields. Drug him to the river and let the water take him, others said in the rice paddies. Turned them chains against the man who chained her, folk murmured in the big house kitchen. But it wasn't just the killing that had folks struck dumb with wonder and terror. It was the way Emily looked walking back from that water, like she was carrying the power of every ancestor who'd suffered in bondage, like she was the living embodiment of every prayer for justice that had ever been whispered into the darkness. Morrison made it halfway back to the plantation house before his strength gave out, before the pain in his broken wrist and the shock of what he'd seen brought him down in the red clay dirt. He lay there gasping like a landed fish, his mind trying to make sense of what had just happened, trying to understand how a slave woman had turned the natural order of the world upside down in the space of a few heartbeats. The field hands found him first, Big Jim and Little Moses and Sarah's boy John, coming back from checking the irrigation ditches when they heard the moaning and carrying on. They stood over Morrison like he was a snake that might still have bite in him, looking down at the man who'd whipped more blackbacks than anybody could count, who'd tracked down more runaways than the devil himself. "Help me," Morrison whispered, his voice weak as a baby bird's. "Get the doctor, get Master Whitmore, get somebody with sense. That woman has gone mad. She killed Master Robert, drug him into the river with them chains. She ain't human no more. She's something else, something that ain't got no fear of God or white man." Big Jim spat into the dirt beside Morrison's head, close enough that the white man could feel the spray on his cheek. "Sound to me like she got plenty fear of God," he said, his voice heavy with satisfaction that had been building up for years. "Sound like she finally found somebody who deserved what she'd been carrying around inside her heart." Little Moses knelt down beside the overseer, not to help him but to look into his eyes real close, to see what fear looked like on the face of someone who'd been handing it out free for so long. "Where your gun at now, Morrison? Where that whip you so fond of using? Seem like when the tables get turned, you ain't quite the man you thought you was." Morrison tried to crawl away from them, tried to put distance between himself and the slaves who was looking at him like he was carrion waiting to be picked clean. But his broken wrist wouldn't support his weight, and every movement sent fire shooting up his arm like lightning in his bones. "Y'all got to help me," he pleaded, and the sound of a white overseer begging black slaves for mercy was so strange it seemed to change the very air around them. Whatever differences we had, whatever happened in the past, we all got to stick together now. That woman ain't right in the head. She gonna kill every white person on this plantation if somebody don't stop her. John looked around at his fellow slaves, saw the same thought forming in every mind at the same time. Here was Morrison, the man who'd separated families, who'd sold children away from their mothers, who'd used his whip like other men used handshakes. Here he was asking for help from the very people he'd spent years tormenting. "Morrison," John said, his voice calm as Sunday morning, "you remember my sister Clara? Pretty girl, maybe 16 years old when you sold her to that trader from Mississippi? Remember how she cried and begged to stay with her family? Remember what you told her when she asked if she'd ever see home again?" Morrison's face went even paler, if such a thing was possible. He remembered Clara, remembered her face, remembered the way she'd fought and pleaded, remembered the satisfaction he'd felt at breaking another spirit that had thought it could resist white authority. "You told her," John continued, "that slaves don't have families, don't have homes, don't have nothing but what their masters allow them to have. You told her she was property, and property goes where it's most useful to its owner. You remember saying that, Morrison?" The overseer nodded weakly, unable to deny words that had been witnessed by dozens of slaves, words that had been carved into their memories like scars cut deep into flesh. "Well," John said, standing up and brushing the dirt off his knees, "seemed to me like you was right about one thing. Property goes where it's most useful, and right now, Morrison, you ain't useful to nobody." The three men walked away then, leaving Morrison lying in that red clay dirt like a broken doll, leaving him to face whatever was coming next without protection from the very people he'd spent years dehumanizing. Behind them, they could hear him calling out, pleading for someone with mercy to help him, but his voice was getting weaker and more desperate with every word. Meanwhile, Emily was walking through the quarters like she was walking through a dream, chains still in her hands, water still dripping from her dress and hair. Everywhere she went, slaves stopped their work to stare, to witness something that none of them had ever thought they'd see in their lifetime. A black woman who'd struck back at her oppressor and lived to tell about it. Old Aunt Sarah was the first to approach her, hobbling out of her cabin with tears streaming down her wrinkled face, reaching out to touch Emily like she was checking to make sure she was real, and not some vision brought on by too much suffering and too little hope. "Child," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Child, what you done? What you gone and done?" Emily stopped walking, looked down at the old woman who'd been like a mother to her since she'd arrived on the plantation as a frightened girl. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of years, the accumulated pain of every slave who'd ever dreamed of striking back, but hadn't found the strength or opportunity. "I done what needed doing, Aunt Sarah. I made sure that young Master Robert won't never put chains on nobody else, won't never drag another human being down to that cellar to break their spirit. I made sure the river got fed what it'd been hungry for. Sarah looked at the chains in Emily's hands, saw the way they seemed to move like living things, saw the power that had somehow transferred from the metal to the woman who held them. And now what, child? Now what happened to you? To all of us? Emily looked around at the faces gathering in the quarters, men and women and children who'd spent their whole lives bowing down to white authority, who'd survived by making themselves small and invisible and grateful for whatever scraps of humanity their masters allowed them to keep. Now, Emily said, her voice growing stronger and more certain with each word, now y'all gotta decide who you gonna be. Y'all gonna keep living like you property, like you something that can be bought and sold and traded away from everything you love? Or y'all gonna remember that you human beings, children of God, people with souls that can't be owned no matter what pieces of paper say? A murmur went through the crowd, voices speaking low but urgent, folks trying to understand what Emily was offering them, what choice she was laying at their feet. Some was excited, seeing the possibility of freedom for the first time in their lives. Others was terrified, knowing that what Emily had done would bring consequences down on every black soul on that plantation. But all of them, every last one, was looking at her like she was something out of the old stories, like she was Harriet Tubman come to lead them to the promised land, like she was the answer to prayers they'd been too afraid to pray out loud. Emily, said Moses, the young man who'd wanted to jump the broom with her before all this started. Emily, you know they gonna send the militia after you. Gonna send dogs and horses and men with guns. They gonna hunt you down like you was a mad animal, and anybody who helped you gonna hang right alongside you. Emily smiled at him, and for the first time in months her smile held warmth instead of just terrible purpose. Moses, you think I don't know that? You think I done what I done without counting the cost? I've been dead since the day they threw me in that cellar. What I am now, what I become, it ain't something that can be killed by guns or rope or any earthly power. She raised the chains above her head, let them catch what light was left of the afternoon sun. Let every slave in that gathering see the transformation that suffering and righteous anger had worked on simple iron. These chains, she called out, her voice carrying to every corner of the quarters. These chains that was meant to bind us, gonna be the tools of our liberation. Every whip, every shackle, every instrument of oppression they ever used against us, we gonna turn them around, make them serve justice instead of cruelty. The crowd was growing larger now, slaves coming from the fields and the big house in every corner of the plantation, drawn by the sound of words they'd never heard spoken aloud, pulled toward the possibility of something they'd only dreamed about in their most secret moments. But even as Emily spoke of liberation and justice, even as she held those chains like scepters of power, everyone could hear it in the distance. The sound of horses' hooves on the main road, the baying of tracking dogs, the voices of white men organizing themselves for war against a single black woman who dared to strike back at her oppressor. Master John Whitmore had found Morrison, had heard the story of his son's death, had sent riders to every plantation in the county calling for help in hunting down the slave who'd committed the unthinkable crime of defending herself. The machinery of white supremacy was grinding into motion, bringing all its power to bear on Emily and anyone who might be fool enough to stand with her. "They coming," whispered Ruth, the pregnant girl who Emily had saved from the lash, the girl whose unborn child was the reason Emily had ended up in that cellar in the first place. "They coming with dogs and guns and rope, coming to make us all pay for what you done." Emily looked toward the main road, could see the dust cloud rising in the distance, could hear the voices of men drunk on righteousness and the promise of violent justice. She knew what was coming, had known since the moment she'd wrapped them chains around young Master Robert's ankles and dragged him to the water. But she also knew something else, something that 90 days in darkness had taught her. Something that suffering had burned into her soul like a brand. There was some things worth dying for, some principles worth any amount of pain, some truths worth paying the ultimate price to preserve. "Let them come," she said, the chains singing in her hands like freedom songs, like spirituals carrying messages of hope and deliverance. "Let them bring their dogs and their guns and their rope. They gonna find out that some spirits can't be chained, some souls can't be broken. Some debts can only be paid with blood. The sound of horses and hounds was getting closer now. The voices of angry white men carried on the evening wind like the howling of demons. But Emily stood there calm as deep water, surrounded by her people, holding the very chains that had been meant to destroy her, transformed by suffering into something that even death couldn't touch. The final confrontation was coming, fast as storm clouds gathering on the horizon. And Emily, with chains that had become weapons of justice, with a spirit that had been forged unbreakable in the fires of oppression, was ready to meet whatever judgment was riding toward them on the wind. Lord of Glory, gather your hearts close now, 'cause what I'm fixing to tell you is the part of this story that'll make the angels weep and the earth itself cry out for the justice that was too long in coming. Emily walking through that plantation with young Master Robert's ankles wrapped in chains, dragging him across the very ground where he'd made so many others suffer, pulling him toward water that had been waiting patient as judgment for this very moment. The sun was hanging low in the western sky like it was trying to hide its face from what was about to happen, and the shadows was getting long across the cotton fields where so much black sweat and blood had watered the white folks' prosperity. Every step Emily took toward that river sounded like thunder in the ears of everyone watching, like the footsteps of destiny finally catching up to accounts that had been overdue for way too long. Young Master Robert was still fighting them chains, still trying to pull himself free from the iron links that had become instruments of divine justice instead of human cruelty. But the harder he struggled, the tighter they seemed to bind him, like they had a will of their own now, like they was eager to reverse the roles they'd played for so many years. "Emily," he gasped, his voice high and thin as a child's, all his master's authority gone now that he was the one being dragged instead of doing the dragging. "Emily, you can't do this. You can't kill a white man. They'll hunt you down. They'll kill every slave on this plantation. Think about your people. Think about what this gonna cost them." Emily didn't answer straight away, just kept walking steady toward that dark water, her bare feet finding purchase in the red clay mud like she was walking a path she'd traveled in dreams for months. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm as Sunday morning, peaceful as someone who'd finally found their purpose after years of searching. "Master Robert," she said, not looking back at him, just keeping her eyes fixed on the river that was calling to her like an old friend. "You think this is about killing? You think this is about revenge? This about justice? About settling accounts that'd been outstanding since the first slave ship crossed the Atlantic?" Behind them, the slaves was following at a distance, not close enough to be accused of helping, but not far enough to miss witnessing something that would live in their memories until their dying day. They moved like people in a trance, like folks watching prophecy unfold before their very eyes, like they was seeing the fulfillment of every prayer for deliverance that had ever been whispered in the darkness of the quarters. Old Sarah was there, leaning on her walking stick, tears streaming down her face as she watched a woman who'd been like a daughter to her become something larger than life, something that carried the hopes and dreams of every soul who'd ever suffered in bondage. Big Jim was there too, his massive hands clenched into fists, his whole body shaking with emotion, as he saw a white master being treated like the animal he'd always claimed black folks was. Even the children was following, wide-eyed and silent, watching something that would shape the way they understood the world for the rest of their lives. They was seeing proof that the strong didn't always triumph over the weak, that cruelty didn't always go unpunished, that sometimes the very instruments of oppression could be turned against the oppressor. Young Master Robert's struggles was getting weaker now, his strength sapped by fear and the realization that nobody was coming to save him, that his white skin and his family name wasn't going to protect him from the justice he'd earned through years of casual cruelty. The chains was cutting into his ankles, drawing blood that mixed with the red clay dirt to make mud the color of old sins coming home to roost. "My father," he wheezed, trying one last desperate appeal to authority and family loyalty. "My father will give you anything you want. Money, freedom papers, safe passage north. Just let me go and we can pretend this never happened. We can start fresh, treat you better, treat all of y'all better." Emily stopped walking then, turned around to look down at the man who'd tried so hard to break her spirit, who'd thought he could own another human being's soul just because some piece of paper said he owned their body. The contempt in her eyes was so pure it was almost beautiful, like looking at justice itself, wearing human form. "Start fresh," she said, and her voice carried the accumulated pain of every slave who'd ever believed their master's promises, who'd ever hoped for mercy that never came. "Treat us better? Master Robert, you had your whole life to treat us better. You had every day since you was old enough to know right from wrong, to choose compassion over cruelty. But what did you choose instead?" She gestured toward the plantation behind them, toward the big house where his family lived in luxury built on human suffering, toward the quarters where her people endured lives of degradation and despair. "You chose to put a pregnant girl's life in danger just to prove your power. You chose to throw me in that cellar for 90 days just because I wouldn't be the instrument of your cruelty. You chose to come after me with more chains, more punishment, more of the same evil that'd been eating at your soul since you drew your first breath." Emily started walking again, pulling young Master Robert through the mud like he was a sack of grain, like he was cargo instead of a person, like he was property that could be moved from place to place at someone else's will. The irony wasn't lost on anyone watching, the master being treated exactly the way he'd treated his human property all his life. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible now, all his strength focused on the impossible task of trying to free himself from chains that seemed to get heavier with each step. "Please, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything. I'll change. I'll be different. I'll make things right." Emily looked down at him with something that might have been pity, if it hadn't been so mixed with the kind of hardness that comes from suffering too much for too long. "Master Robert, sorry is just a word. Change is just talk. But this," she said, raising the chains so he could see them clearly, "this is action. This is justice making itself known in a world that thought it could hide from consequences forever." They was getting close to the river now, close enough to hear the sound of water moving over rocks and fallen logs, close enough to smell the muddy richness of the bank where so many tears had been shed and so many prayers had been whispered. The current was running swift and dark, swollen with spring rains and hungry for whatever offerings might come its way. Emily had spent 3 days by this water, preparing herself for what was coming, making peace with whatever spirits lived in the depths, asking the ancestors to guide her hand when the moment of reckoning finally arrived. She'd felt them gathering around her during them long hours of meditation, felt their approval, radiating up from the water like warmth from a fire. The slaves who was following stopped at the edge of the cotton field, not daring to come closer to what was about to happen, but unable to turn away from the sight of justice finally being served after so many years of injustice. They stood there like witnesses at a trial, like jury members watching a verdict being carried out, like congregation members seeing a miracle unfold before their very eyes. Young Master Robert's breathing was getting ragged now, his face pale as morning mist, his eyes wide with the kind of terror that comes from finally understanding that your actions have consequences, that the cruelty you've handed out so freely is about to be returned to you with interest. "Emily," he said one last time, his voice breaking like a boy's. "Emily, I'm begging you. I'm begging for my life. Doesn't that mean nothing to you? Don't you got any mercy in your heart?" Emily stopped at the water's edge, looked down at the man who'd never shown mercy to anyone weaker than himself, who'd built his sense of superiority on the systematic degradation of other human beings. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of every plea for mercy that had ever been ignored, every cry for compassion that had fallen on deaf ears. "Master Robert," she said, her voice as steady as the flow of the river itself, "you remember all them times slaves begged you for mercy. Remember how you laughed at their tears, how you used their desperation to amuse yourself. Remember how you told them that mercy was for equals, and slaves wasn't equal to nothing." She knelt down beside him, looked into his eyes so he could see the depth of suffering he'd caused, could understand the magnitude of the debt he'd accumulated through years of casual evil. "This is mercy," she said, gesturing toward the dark water that would soon claim him. "This is more mercy than you ever showed to any of us. This is a quick end to a life that brought nothing but pain to everyone it touched. This is the river washing away a stain that been marking this place for too long." Young Master Robert opened his mouth to say something else, maybe another plea or maybe a curse, but Emily was already standing up, already beginning the final phase of what needed to be done. The chains in her hands felt warm now, alive with purpose, eager to complete the work they'd been transformed to do. The water was calling, patient as judgment, deep as the grave, ready to receive what was owed and settle accounts that had been outstanding for far too long. And Emily, transformed by 90 days in darkness into an instrument of divine justice, prepared to give the river what it had been waiting for. The sun was setting behind them, painting the sky the color of blood and fire, like the heavens themselves was bearing witness to what was about to happen. And in that red light, with the sound of water lapping at the muddy bank and the weight of history pressing down on everyone present, Emily prepared to close a chapter that had been written in suffering and sealed with tears. Justice was about to be served, cold and final as the grave, and the river would carry away what needed to be carried away, leaving behind only the memory of a woman who'd refused to be broken, and the knowledge that some debts can only be paid in full. Sweet Lord Almighty, what I'm about to tell you now is the moment when heaven and earth held their breath, when the very waters of creation opened up to receive what justice demanded and the ancestors had been waiting for. Emily standing on that muddy bank with young Master Robert chained at her feet, the river flowing dark and patient as judgment itself, ready to wash away sins that had been staining that plantation for 3 generations. The water was running swift and deep from the spring rains, carrying branches and leaves and all manner of things downstream toward the sea, where all debts eventually find their reckoning. But this evening it was hungry for something more than fallen timber and storm debris. It was ready to claim what the spirits had marked for collection, ready to balance books that had been kept in blood and tears for far too long. Emily looked down at young Master Robert one last time, seeing not the arrogant master who'd thrown her into that cellar, but something smaller and more pathetic, a man who'd spent his whole life thinking his white skin made him better than other folks, who'd built his sense of worth on the systematic degradation of human beings he'd been taught to see as property. "Master Robert," she said, her voice carrying across the water like a prayer, like a final blessing before communion. "You understand now what you're facing. You understand that this ain't about hate or revenge. This about restoring balance to a world that's been tilted wrong for too long?" Young Master Robert's eyes was wide with terror now, darting back and forth between Emily's face and the dark water that would soon claim him. His breath was coming in short gasps, like a man drowning in air before he ever touched the river, like someone whose soul was already sinking even though his body was still on dry land. "Emily," he whispered, his voice breaking like a child's. "Emily, if there's any humanity left in you, any mercy, please don't do this. I know I've been wrong. I know I caused suffering, but killing me ain't gonna bring back nobody who died, ain't gonna heal nobody who been hurt." Emily knelt down beside him again, close enough that he could see the depths of pain in her eyes, close enough that he could understand the magnitude of what his cruelty had created. When she spoke, her words was gentle as a mother's lullaby, but final as the grave. "Master Robert, you think this about bringing folks back? You think this about healing what been broken? No, child. This about making sure that the cycle of cruelty stops here, stops with you. This about ensuring that no more pregnant girls get threatened with the lash, no more proud women get buried alive in darkness, no more families get torn apart for the entertainment of folks who forgot they human." She stood up, the chains in her hands catching what light was left of the dying sun, iron links that had been transformed from instruments of bondage into tools of divine justice. Around her, the air seemed to shimmer with presence, ancestors gathering to witness the moment their suffering would finally be acknowledged, spirits rising from the water to welcome home a debt that was long overdue. "The water been waiting for you," Emily said, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of an old spiritual, the kind of song that carries messages between this world and the next. Waiting, patient as stone, deep as sorrow, hungry for the justice that ain't never been served. All them tears that got shed in your cellar, all them prayers that went unanswered in your quarters, all them souls that suffered under your hand, they all been flowing into this river, making it strong enough to carry what's coming. Young Master Robert tried one last time to free himself from the chains, thrashing and pulling like a landed fish, but the iron held him fast. The very metal that had bound Emily's body for 90 days now bound his, and there was a terrible poetry in that reversal, a cosmic justice that made the universe itself seem to sigh with satisfaction. "Please," he sobbed, all dignity gone now, all pretense of superiority washed away by the flood of his own terror. "Please, I'll do anything, give anything, become anything you want. Just don't let me die like this. Don't let me drown chained up like an animal." Emily's face softened for just a moment, touched by the irony of his words, by the way he was finally understanding what it felt like to be treated like something less than human. "Master Robert," she said, "every slave you ever owned died chained up like an animal, even if they drew their last breath in a bed. You chained their spirits, chained their hopes, chained their dreams. The only difference is, your chains is iron and theirs was made of law and custom, and the kind of cruelty that passes from father to son like inherited disease." She began pulling him toward the water then, the chains making furrows in the muddy bank, as he was dragged across ground that had been watered with the sweat and blood of the enslaved for generations. Each foot of progress toward the river was another step toward justice, another moment of reckoning for sins that had compounded like interest on an unpaid debt. The water was cold when it first touched young Master Robert's feet, cold as the grave he'd dug for himself with years of casual evil. He cried out at the shock of it, tried to pull back from the inevitable, but Emily's grip on them chains was steady as the flow of time itself, implacable as the justice of the Lord. "Emily," he screamed as the water reached his waist, as he felt the current beginning to pull at him with fingers colder than death. "Emily, this is murder. This is evil. You gonna burn in hell for this." Emily smiled then, and it was the most beautiful smile anyone had ever seen, peaceful as Sunday morning, radiant as the face of someone who'd finally found their purpose after years of searching. "Master Robert," she said, her voice carrying across the water like a blessing, "hell is what you made for other folks to live in. Hell is 90 days in a cellar with chains cutting into your flesh. Hell is watching your children get sold away and not being able to do nothing about it. Hell is working yourself to death making other people rich, while they treat you like you ain't even human." The water was up to his chest now, cold and dark and hungry for what it had been promised. Young Master Robert's struggles was getting weaker, his body beginning to understand what his mind refused to accept, that this was the end of his story, the final chapter of a life that had brought nothing but misery to everyone it touched. "This ain't hell," Emily continued, beginning to wade deeper into the current herself, following young Master Robert into water that would claim them both, but for different reasons. "This is baptism. This is washing away the sin that's been staining this place since before I was born. This is the river doing what rivers always do, carrying away what don't belong and making space for something new to grow." The current was stronger now, pulling at both of them with the insistent force of destiny fulfilled. Young Master Robert went under once, came up sputtering and gasping, went under again and stayed down longer. Each time he surfaced, his face was paler, his movements weaker, his voice more desperate. "I can't swim!" he cried out, the ultimate irony of his situation finally hitting him. That he, who'd lived his whole life on a plantation bordered by water, who'd owned people who could navigate these rivers in the dark, had never learned the skill that might have saved him. "Emily, I can't swim. Help me, please." But Emily was beyond helping him now, beyond any mercy that could change the course of what was happening. She stood waist-deep in that dark water, the chains still wrapped around her hands, watching as the river claimed what belonged to it, as justice finally found its voice in the sound of rushing water and choking gasps. "Don't need to swim where you going," she said, her voice barely audible above the sound of the current. "Don't need nothing but the weight of what you done, the chains of your own making, the water that been waiting patient as judgment for this very moment." Young Master Robert went under a third time, and this time the water held him down, like hands pressing on his chest, like the accumulated weight of every wrong he'd ever committed finally settling on his shoulders. The chains around his ankles was pulling him deeper, dragging him to places where no amount of white privilege could follow, where family names meant nothing and inherited wealth couldn't buy redemption. Emily felt the moment when his struggles stopped, felt the exact instant when his soul left his body, and the water accepted its offering. The current seemed to sigh with satisfaction, like a hunger that had finally been fed, like a thirst that had finally been quenched with the wine of justice. She stood there in that cold water for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, feeling the presence of every ancestor who'd suffered in bondage, feeling their approval radiating up from the depths like warmth from a hidden fire. The river had claimed what it was owed, had balanced books that had been kept in blood and tears for far too long. When Emily finally waded back to shore, the chain still in her hands but somehow lighter now, she found the slaves still standing at the edge of the cotton field, watching in silence that was deeper than any praise song, more powerful than any testimony. They had witnessed something that would live in their memories until their dying day, the moment when justice wore human form and the river ran red with righteousness. Old Sarah was weeping openly now, tears of joy and sorrow and release all mixed together, running down her weathered cheeks like rain after a long drought. Big Jim was standing with his hat in his hands, like he was in church witnessing the resurrection, like he was seeing the dead brought back to life. The children was silent, wide-eyed with wonder at seeing their world turned upside down, at understanding for the first time that the powerful wasn't always invincible, that cruelty didn't always go unpunished, that sometimes the very weakest among them could become instruments of divine justice. Emily walked out of that water transformed once again, no longer the broken woman who'd been thrown into the cellar, no longer even the vengeful spirit who'd dragged her oppressor to his death. She was something new now, something purified by suffering and sanctified by justice, something that carried the hopes and dreams of every soul who'd ever been chained in body but never in spirit. The water lapped at the muddy bank behind her, carrying secrets downstream, whispering stories of a woman who'd chosen righteousness over survival and found power in the very depths of her oppression. And somewhere in that current, justice flowed patient and eternal toward whatever reckoning awaited downstream. The river had done its work, had claimed what belonged to it, had washed away a stain that had been marking that place for 3 generations. And Emily, baptized in the waters of retribution, walked back toward dry land with chains that was no longer symbols of bondage, but reminders of the price that evil always pays in the end. Lord, have mercy on what I'm about to tell you now, 'cause this here's the part of Emily's story that shows how justice and freedom ain't always the same thing, how doing what's right don't always lead to what's easy. Emily walking out of that dark water like she was walking out of the Red Sea itself, but knowing full well that the promised land was still a long way off, and the journey was fixing to get harder before it got easier. The slaves was still standing there at the edge of them cotton fields, watching Emily emerge from the river like some kind of water spirit, like a conjure woman who'd just finished the most powerful working anybody'd ever seen. The chains in her hands was dripping river water, each drop falling to the ground like baptismal tears, like the earth itself was being blessed by what had just happened. But even as they watched this miracle unfold before their eyes, even as they felt something deep in their souls celebrate the death of their oppressor, every slave on that plantation knew what was coming next. They could hear it already, the sound of horses and hounds getting closer, the voices of angry white men organizing themselves for war against a single black woman who dared to kill one of their own. Emily stood on that muddy bank, water streaming from her torn dress, mud between her toes, looking like she'd been baptized in the very depths of righteousness. But when she turned to face her people, when she saw the mixture of awe and terror in their faces, she understood that her victory had come at a price that wouldn't just be paid by her alone. "Y'all need to get away from here," she said, her voice carrying across the evening air like a mother's warning, like someone trying to save children from a fire she couldn't put out. "Get back to your cabins. Act like you ain't seen nothing. Don't know nothing about what happened here. They gonna come with questions and rope and the kind of anger that don't care who gets hurt as long as somebody pays." But old Sarah stepped forward, her walking stick trembling in her gnarled hands, her eyes blazing with something that looked like pride mixed with heartbreak. "Child," she said, her voice cracking with emotion, "Child, you think we gonna abandon you now? You think after what you just done for all of us, we gonna turn our backs and pretend we don't know your name?" Emily looked at the old woman who'd been like a mother to her, saw the love and loyalty shining in those ancient eyes, and felt her heart break just a little. She'd known this moment would come, had understood since the day she'd wrapped them chains around young Master Robert's ankles, that her people would want to stand with her, would want to share whatever fate was coming down the road. "Aunt Sarah," Emily said, walking over to take the old woman's hands in her own, feeling how fragile they were, how much life they'd lived, and how much suffering they'd endured. "Aunt Sarah, what I done for all of y'all. But that don't mean y'all gotta die for it. That don't mean your children gotta hang for my choices." Around them, the other slaves was murmuring amongst themselves, some saying they should run, others saying they should fight, still others saying they should stand with Emily no matter what came. The sound of their voices was like music to her ears, the music of people who'd found their courage, who'd remembered what it felt like to have choices, who'd seen that even the most powerless among them could strike back at injustice. But Emily knew something they didn't know yet, something that 90 days in that cellar had taught her about the cost of resistance, about the price that always got paid when slaves dared to fight back against their masters. She'd seen it in visions during them long, dark nights, had felt it in her bones like prophecy written in pain and blood. "Listen to me," she said, raising her voice so every soul in that gathering could hear her, speaking with the authority of someone who'd been to hell and back and learned truths that couldn't be taught any other way. "What happened here tonight, what I done to Master Robert, that was my choice, my burden to carry, my debt to pay. But y'all still got lives to live, children to raise, futures to hope for. Don't throw all that away for the sake of standing with a woman who's already dead." The words hung in the evening air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and every slave in that gathering understood what Emily was telling them, that she'd never expected to survive what she'd done, that she'd chosen justice over life and was prepared to pay the ultimate price for that choice. Big Jim stepped forward then, his massive frame blocking out what little light was left in the western sky, his voice rumbling like distant thunder when he spoke. "Emily," he said, "Emily, you think we care more about our own skins than we do about justice? You think after seeing what you done, after watching you kill that devil with his own chains, we gonna just go back to picking cotton and saying, 'Yes, massa,' like nothing changed?" Emily looked at him, saw the fire burning in his eyes, saw the way his hands was clenched into fists like he was ready to fight the whole world if necessary. She saw the same fire in Moses's face, in John's, in every man and woman, and even some of the older children who'd witnessed what happened by the river. "I think," Emily said carefully, "that y'all got something now that you ain't never had before. You got the knowledge that the master ain't invincible, that white folks bleed just like anybody else, that cruelty can be answered with righteous anger. But knowledge ain't the same as freedom, and fighting ain't the same as winning." She gestured toward the main road where the sound of approaching horses was getting louder by the minute, where the baying of tracking dogs was cutting through the evening air like the howl of demons coming to collect their due. "They gonna come here with more guns than we got, people, more hate than we got strength. They gonna kill every black soul on this plantation if they think it'll make them feel better about losing one of their precious masters. Y'all want to honor what I done? Then live. Live and remember. Live and tell your children what happened here. Live and carry the knowledge that justice can be served, even when the cost is higher than anybody wants to pay." But even as Emily spoke these words, even as she tried to send her people away to safety, she could see in their faces that it was too late for that kind of wisdom. They'd tasted something by that river that couldn't be swallowed back down, had seen something that couldn't be unseen, had felt their own power in a way that made going back to slavery impossible. Ruth stepped forward then, the pregnant girl whose life Emily had saved by refusing to whip her, her hands pressed to her swollen belly like she was protecting the future growing inside her. "Emily," she said, her young voice carrying the weight of prophecy, "Emily, the baby I'm carrying, your baby, in a way, since you the one who saved us both, this child gonna grow up knowing that somebody fought for them before they was even born. Gonna grow up hearing the story of Emily of the Chains, the woman who said no to the master and meant it." Emily felt tears on her cheeks for the first time since she'd come up from that cellar. Salt water mixing with river water, sorrow and joy tangled together like roots of the same tree. She looked at Ruth, at this young woman who carried the future in her womb, and understood something that hadn't been clear before, that her victory wasn't measured in the death of one cruel master, but in the life of one unborn child who would grow up free in ways that had nothing to do with laws or papers. "Ruth," Emily whispered, reaching out to touch the girl's belly where new life was growing. You tell that baby what you seen here. You tell them that freedom ain't something that gets given to you. It's something you take, something you claim, something you're willing to die for. You tell them that their mama was saved by a woman who understood that some things is worth any amount of suffering. The sound of horses was very close now, close enough that they could see torches flickering through the trees, close enough that they could hear individual voices calling out for blood and vengeance. Master John Whitmore was coming with every white man in the county, coming with rope and guns and the kind of righteous anger that made lynch mobs feel justified in their cruelty. Emily looked around one last time at the people who'd become her family, at the faces marked by suffering, but illuminated now by something that looked almost like hope. She'd given them something that night that was worth more than gold, more valuable than freedom papers, more lasting than any law that might be written by white legislators. She'd given them the knowledge that they were human beings, worthy of dignity, capable of resistance. Go now, she said, stepping back toward the river, toward the water that had claimed her oppressor and would soon claim her too. Go and remember. Remember that Emily of the Chains lived and fought and died for the right to say no to evil. Remember that justice ain't always quick, but it's always certain. Remember that the river runs deep and the ancestors watch over their children, even in the darkest times. The slaves began to drift away then, some reluctantly, some with tears in their eyes, all of them carrying something they'd never had before, the memory of seeing their oppressor defeated, the knowledge that resistance was possible, the understanding that freedom wasn't just a dream, but something that could be seized by anyone brave enough to pay its price. Emily stood alone by that dark water, the chains still in her hands, listening to the sound of horses and hounds getting closer with every heartbeat. She'd liberated something that night that was bigger than herself, more important than her individual survival. She'd liberated the spirit of resistance that had been sleeping in her people's hearts, had shown them that even the most powerless could become instruments of divine justice. The water lapped at her feet, whispering promises of peace and rest, reminding her that some battles could only be won by those willing to lose everything in the fighting. And Emily, baptized in righteousness and sanctified by suffering, prepared to meet whatever judgment was riding toward her on the night wind. She'd done what she came to do. The rest was in the hands of the Lord and the ancestors and the dark water that had accepted her offering and would soon accept her too. Come close now, children, 'cause this here's the end of the story, but it ain't the end of the telling. What I'm fixing to share with you is how Emily's name became legend, how her choice by that dark river sent ripples through time that's still moving today, how one woman's refusal to bow down changed the way folks understand what it means to be human in a world that tries to take your humanity away. When them white men finally reached that river with their torches and their dogs and their rope, when they found young Master Robert's body floating face down in the current with chains wrapped around his ankles, when they saw Emily standing on that muddy bank with her head held high and righteousness burning in her eyes, that's when they understood they wasn't dealing with just another runaway slave or another case of plantation discipline gone wrong. They was facing something they'd never seen before and didn't know how to handle. A black woman who'd transformed suffering into power, who'd turned their own instruments of oppression against them, who stood before them unafraid, even though she knew what was coming next. Master John Whitmore rode his horse right up to the water's edge, his face twisted with grief and rage and something that might have been fear. Behind him, 24 white men with guns and torches, ready to visit terrible vengeance on anyone connected to his son's death. But when he looked down at Emily, when he saw the calm acceptance in her face, the chains still gripped in her hands like scepters of divine authority, his voice caught in his throat like he was seeing a ghost or an angel, or something else that didn't belong in the natural world. "You killed my boy," he said finally, his words coming out broken and raw like they was being torn from his chest. "You murdered my son and drug him into this river like he was some kind of animal." Emily looked up at him, this old man who'd built his wealth on human misery, who'd raised his son to believe that cruelty was a birthright and suffering was something that only happened to people whose skin was the wrong color. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of every prayer for justice that had ever been whispered in the darkness. "Master Whitmore," she said, Your boy killed himself the day he decided that other folks wasn't human. I just helped him understand what he'd been too blind to see. That every chain you put on somebody else's body eventually finds its way around your own neck. The white men behind Master Whitmore was shifting restlessly, fingering their guns, waiting for the word to start shooting. But something about Emily's presence held them back, something that made violence seem smaller and meaner than the moment required. She stood there like judgment incarnate, like justice wearing human form, and even her enemies could feel the power that radiated from her, like heat from a forge. "Hang her," one of the men called out from the back of the crowd. "Hang her high and let every slave in the county see what happens to uppity ones who forget their place." But Master Whitmore raised his hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Emily's face, trying to understand how a woman he'd seen as property had become something that made him feel like he was the smaller person in this confrontation. "You know what's coming?" he said to her. "You know we can't let this stand. Can't let word get out that slaves can kill their masters and live to brag about it. You got any last words before we finish this?" Emily smiled then, and it was the same terrible, beautiful smile that had shaken young Master Robert's confidence, that had made him understand his own mortality for the first time in his privileged life. But now that smile held something else too. Peace, acceptance, the satisfaction of someone who'd completed their life's work and was ready to rest. "I got plenty words," she said, her voice carrying across the water like a sermon, like a testimony that would be remembered long after the speakers and listeners was all gone to their reward. "I got words for every slave who thinks they powerless, every master who thinks they untouchable, every person who believes that cruelty can go unanswered forever." She raised the chains above her head, let them catch the flickering light of the torches. Let every man present see the transformation that suffering and righteousness had worked on simple iron. "These chains," she called out, her voice rising like a spiritual, like a song of deliverance that would echo through generations. "These chains that was meant to bind us became the tools of our liberation. Every whip, every shackle, every instrument of oppression you ever used against us, we can turn them around, make them serve justice instead of cruelty." The white men was muttering among themselves now, disturbed by something in Emily's manner, something that made her execution feel less like justice and more like martyrdom. But they'd come too far to turn back, had too much invested in the idea that white supremacy was the natural order of things to let one defiant slave live to inspire others. "Enough talking," Master Whitmore said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had carried when he'd first arrived. "Morrison, get that rope ready. Let's finish this before word spreads, and we got every slave in South Carolina thinking they can murder their masters." But as Morrison, his broken hand wrapped in bloody bandages, fumbled with the hangman's noose, as the white men formed a circle around Emily like wolves closing in on wounded prey, something unexpected happened. From the darkness beyond the torchlight, voices began to rise in song. It started with old Sarah, standing just out of sight in the cypress trees. Her ancient voice cracked but strong as she sang the opening lines of "Wade in the Water." Then Ruth joined in, her young voice harmonizing with the elders, followed by Big Jim's bass rumble, Moses's tenor, John's baritone, until every slave on the Whitmore plantation was singing together, their voices weaving a spiritual that carried messages of hope and resistance, and the promise that Emily's sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten. The white men looked around nervously, fingering their weapons, but they couldn't see their targets in the darkness, couldn't tell how many slaves was out there or what they might be planning. The song seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like the very trees and water was joining in the chorus, like the earth itself was bearing witness to what was happening. Emily closed her eyes and let that music wash over her, felt the love and support of her people surrounding her like a cloak of righteousness. She'd never felt less alone in her life, even though she was about to die. She'd never felt more connected to something larger than herself, even though her individual story was about to end. "Go ahead," she said to Master Whitmore, opening her eyes and looking directly at him with no fear, no regret, no plea for mercy. "Do what you came to do. But understand that killing me won't kill what I represent, won't stop the story from spreading, won't keep other Emilys from rising up when the time comes for justice to be served." They hung her there by the river, with the sound of her people's voices rising like prayers into the darkness, with the water flowing past, carrying secrets and promises downstream. But even as the rope tightened around her neck, even as the breath left her body and her spirit prepared to join the ancestors, Emily knew that her death was just another beginning, another chapter in a story that was bigger than any individual life. Her body swayed in the night wind like a dark bell tolling for justice, like a sign that would be remembered and retold for generations. The white men rode away, thinking they'd solved their problem, thinking they'd restored order to a world that was threatening to turn upside down. But they was wrong about that, just like they was wrong about so many things. They'd created something bigger than they could control, started something that would spread like wildfire through the slave quarters of the South, give hope to folks who'd forgotten what hope looked like, inspire resistance in places they'd never dreamed it could take root. Emily of the Chains became legend before her body was even cold. Her story traveled on the Underground Railroad, was whispered in hush harbors, was sung in coded spirituals that carried messages of defiance from plantation to plantation. Children who'd never heard her name learned her story, understood from it that even the most powerless could find ways to fight back, that justice might be delayed, but it was never denied, forever. And by that dark river where she'd dragged her oppressor to his death, where she'd paid the ultimate price for refusing to bow down to evil, folks say you can still hear chains rattling in the night wind. Not the chains of bondage, but the chains of justice, reminding anyone who'll listen that some debts always come due, that cruelty always finds its answer, that the human spirit can't be bought or sold or broken no matter what laws get written or what masters claim to own. Years passed, and the plantation system crumbled, and the chains was struck from every wrist and ankle in the South. But Emily's story lived on, passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, from father to son, from one generation of freedom fighters to the next. Her name became a password among those who remembered, a reminder that resistance was possible, a promise that justice would always find a way. Now listen close, children, 'cause this here's the truth that Emily died to preserve. You ain't nobody's property, no matter what papers say or laws claim. Your soul belongs to God, your dignity belongs to you, and your freedom is something you got to claim for yourself. Something you got to be willing to fight for. Something you got to be ready to die for if that's what it takes. The chains might change. The masters might look different. The plantation might have new names and new faces. But the spirit that lived in Emily of the Chains, the refusal to bow down to evil, the willingness to pay any price for justice, that spirit lives on in anyone brave enough to say no to oppression, strong enough to turn their suffering into power, wise enough to understand that some things is worth more than life itself. And when you hear chains rattling in the darkness, when you feel the weight of injustice pressing down on your shoulders, when you think you ain't got no power to change the world around you, you remember Emily. Remember that one woman with chains in her hands and righteousness in her heart changed the way a whole people understood what they was capable of. Remember that the river still runs deep, and the ancestors still watch over their children, and justice still finds its way home, even when it takes longer than we want and costs more than we think we can afford to pay. Remember Emily of the Chains, who refused to bow down and showed a whole people what freedom really looks like, not in the papers that set you loose, but in the spirit that can never be chained, in the dignity that can never be taken away, in the knowledge that you're human no matter what anybody else tries to tell you. Quem sofreu, sofreu. Quem resistiu deixou memória. E memória a gente guarda aqui, nos Souls of Slavery.